Who really discovered America before Columbus? The question itself feels like a trick, a little piece of bait for a barstool debate. We picture Viking longships slicing through icy Atlantic waters, or perhaps even an apocryphal tale of a Chinese treasure fleet. But the truth is far more profound and much, much older. The real story doesn't involve grand ships or royal decrees. It involves footsteps. The footsteps of hunters and families moving through a world of ice and wind that we can barely comprehend, stepping into a land that had never known the press of a human foot. Their journey is one of the greatest adventure stories in human history, yet they left no written records, no self-aggrandizing monuments. All they left were their genes, scattered stones, and the faint, lingering ghosts of their campfires. Tonight, we're going to search for those ghosts and begin our story at the true beginning of human history in the Americas. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you'd like, let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you down in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where these stories travel in the night. And now, settle in, let the weight of the day fall away. Our journey begins in the bitter cold of the last great ice age. The world is a different place 20,000 years ago. It's a sterner, harder planet, groaning under the weight of incomprehensible amounts of ice. Two colossal ice sheets, the Laurentide and the Cordilleran, sit upon North America like immense frozen crowns, in some places miles thick. So much of the world's water is locked up in these glacial behemoths that the oceans themselves have shrunk, pulling back from the coastlines like a shallow tide. This global thirst of the ice reveals new lands, sunken coastlines now exposed to the air and sun. And in the far north, where the tip of Siberia almost kisses the edge of Alaska, the receding water reveals not a strait, but a bridge of land, immense and sprawling, connecting Asia to the Americas. This isn't some narrow, precarious ice bridge from a movie. This is a vast, lost subcontinent. We call it Byrrhenia. It's nearly 1,000 miles wide, a sweeping expanse of cold, arid grassland known as a mammoth steppe. It's a world without trees, an endless rolling plain under a vast, pale sky, whipped by a relentless wind that scours the dry earth. But it is not lifeless. Great herds of woolly mammoth, lumbering giants with curved tusks, graze on the tough grasses. Herds of steppe bison, shaggy horses, and caribou drift across the landscape, and stalking them are predators, the scimitar-toothed cat, the short-faced bear, and small, clever bands of human beings. For a long, long time, this was the accepted story, neat and tidy. The theory went that these Siberian hunters, wrapped in furs and armed with stone-tipped spears, simply followed the herds. They walked out of Asia across the wide-open plains of Beringia and straight into Alaska. It made perfect sense, but there was a catch, a very large, very frozen catch. Remember those two ice sheets covering Canada? They were fused together, creating an impenetrable wall of ice from the Pacific to the Atlantic. So the story had to have a second act. Our wandering hunters, having made it into Alaska, were now trapped. For thousands of years they lived in this northern refuge, waiting. Then, around 13,500 years ago, the climate warmed just enough for the two great ice sheets to begin melting, pulling away from each other right down the spine of the Rocky Mountains. A narrow, navigable path appeared, the ice-free corridor, and through this freshly opened lane the first people poured, a human river flowing down into the heart of a truly new world, a continent teeming with animals that had never seen a human before. It's a beautiful, dramatic story, and for decades it was the only story. The problem, as is so often the case in history, was a small, inconvenient discovery that refused to fit the narrative, then another and another. Archaeologists, digging deep into the soil of southern Chile at a site called Monte Verde, found clear evidence of human settlement. They found the remains of hide-covered huts, stone tools, even a child's footprint preserved in the soft clay near a hearth. And when they dated the site, the results sent a shockwave through the field, 14,500 years old, at least. That's a full millennium before the ice-free corridor was supposed to have opened. How could people be living at the uttermost end of the earth 1,000 years before the front door was even unlocked? It was impossible. It was like finding footprints on a freshly paved road, dated to the day before the cement was poured. The neat, tatey story of a single, dramatic migration down a continental corridor began to crumble. A new theory, once dismissed as fringe speculation, began to seem not only plausible, but necessary. This other idea is quieter, less like a grand march and more like a long, patient coastal journey. It's called the coastal migration theory, or sometimes, more poetically, the Kelp Highway. The logic is simple. While the interior of the continent was buried under ice, the Pacific coastline was not. As the glaciers began their slow retreat, a sliver of habitable land, dotted with coves and inlets and fjords, would have been exposed along the coast. For people who knew how to live from the sea, this would have been a paradise, a world rich in seals, sea lions, otters, seabirds, shellfish, and dense forests of edible kelp. Instead of walking into the heart of the ice, what if the first Americans had boats, not grand sailing vessels, but small, durable watercraft made of skin and driftwood? What if they simply hopped from island to island, from bay to bay, following the rich coastline from Siberia, along the southern edge of Beringia, and down the Pacific coast of the Americas? They wouldn't have needed to brave an icy, barren corridor. They could have traveled relatively quickly, sustained by the endless bounty of the sea. This would easily explain how people could be in Chile so early. A family in a boat can travel far faster than a family walking, and the highway of the coast was open for business long before the icy corridor of the interior. It's an elegant, compelling solution to the Monteverde paradox, but it has its own ghost haunting it. Where is the proof? Where are the boats, the coastal campsites, the ancient heaps of discarded shells? The answer is heartbreaking for archaeologists. They're gone, drowned. Remember how the sea levels rose when the great ice sheets melted? That same thaw that opened the interior corridor also submerged the ancient coastline, burying the evidence of this potential journey under hundreds of feet of Pacific Ocean. So we are left with a grand historical mystery, a choice between two powerful stories. One, a dramatic march through a corridor of ice, with evidence you can hold in your hand, but a timeline that doesn't quite add up. The other, a patient voyage along a lost coastline, a theory that explains everything but whose primary evidence is now inaccessible, resting in the cold, dark silence of the abyss. The true story may well be a combination of both, but for now, as we close our eyes, we can imagine them. Small groups, huddled around a fire on a rocky beach, the cries of seabirds in the air, the smell of salt and smoke. They look out at the water, at the next headland, the next island disappearing into the mist. They do not know they are discovering a hemisphere. They only know they are surviving, pushing onward, their anonymous journey the first quiet heartbeat of human life in the ancient Americas. Whether they came by the quiet coastal route or down that dramatic windswept corridor of ice, the people who spread into the heart of the Americas found a world of wonders. It was a land of immense forests, vast grasslands, and towering mountains, a landscape populated by creatures from a dream of a larger, wilder earth. Here were camels and horses, native to this continent, and lions far larger than those of Africa. And then there were the true giants, the megafauna, towering Columbian mammoths with tusks so long they curved back on themselves, roamed in great herds. Their cousins, the stockier forest-dwelling mastodons, browsed on spruce and pine, and in the woodlands, giant ground sloths, some as large as a modern elephant, ambled slowly, rising on their hind legs to pull down high branches. For the first few thousand years, the human presence in this world was a quiet one, a scattered and faint signature on the land. But then, around 13,000 years ago, something new appeared, a technological innovation, a specific and deadly idea that would not only transform the lives of these Paleo-Indian people, but would also leave behind the first truly unmistakable calling card in the archaeological record, a calling card that would be scattered across an entire continent. It was a spear point. But to call it just a spear point is like calling a Swiss watch just a timepiece. It was an object of lethal elegance and incredible technical skill, a masterpiece of Stone Age engineering. We call it the Clovis Point, named for the town in New Mexico, near where the first examples were found in the 1930s, lying directly among the bones of a mammoth. They were typically long and slender, shaped like a lance head, with razor-sharp edges worked from high-quality stone like chert, flint, or the beautiful volcanic glass obsidian. But their truly unique feature, their secret ingredient, was the flute. From the base of the point, the ancient craftsman would strike off one final, long, thin flake, creating a channel or groove running partway up the center. This flute was a stroke of genius. It allowed the point to be fitted snugly into the split end of a wooden or bone foreshaft, which was in turn fitted to a longer spear shaft. The result was a strong, stable, and deeply penetrating weapon, a tool perfectly designed to slice through the thick hide and muscle of a multi-ton animal. It was, in essence, the armor-piercing round of the Paleolithic world. To hold a Clovis point in your hand is to feel a connection to a distant and dangerous time. You can imagine the person who made it, a process requiring immense patience and a deep understanding of the stone. They would sit, perhaps by a fire on a cold evening, turning the raw stone in their hands, seeing the finished point already existing within it. With a hammerstone of antler or dense bone, they would carefully strike the edges, flaking away material in a precise sequence, the sharp tink of the impacts echoing in the quiet of the pre-dawn. The final, terrifyingly difficult strike to create the flute was the moment of truth, a move that could shatter hours of work if done incorrectly. But when it worked, the result was a perfect weapon ready for the hunt. And the hunt was the center of the Clovis world. A single mammoth kill could feed a band of people for weeks. Its hide would provide shelter and clothing. Its bones could be fashioned into tools and even parts of dwellings, and its ivory tusks could be carved into shafts, needles, and perhaps objects of ritual significance we can only guess at. Imagine a small band of hunters, perhaps 10 or 15 individuals, moving through a landscape of spruce and pine on a cold, clear morning. They are light on their feet, attuned to every sound, every scent on the wind. They have been tracking a lone mammoth for days, and now they have it cornered in a narrow arroyo. The animal is immense, a wall of muscle and shaggy hair, its great tusks sweeping the air as it trumpets in anger and fear. The hunters are small and fragile by comparison, but they have their wits, their courage, and their fluted points. They do not charge head-on. That would be suicide. Instead, they use the landscape, flanking the great beast, jabbing at its legs and underbelly with their heavy spears, perhaps thrown with the aid of an atlatl, a spear thrower that acted as a powerful lever for the arm. The points are designed to create deep, bleeding wounds. The goal is not to kill the mammoth outright, but to wound it, to weaken it, to make it bleed until it collapses from exhaustion and blood loss. It is a terrifying close-quarters dance with death, a struggle that leaves the hunters exhausted, spattered with blood, but victorious. The work that follows is one of reverence and industry, as the entire animal is processed, a gift from the landscape that ensures the survival of the people. The most remarkable thing about the Clovis people, however, is not just their hunting prowess, but their sheer geographic range. From the woodlands of Florida to the plains of Montana, from the coasts of California to the forests of Nova Scotia, archaeologists have found their distinctive fluted points. For a period of perhaps only 400 or 500 years, a single, identifiable culture seems to have dominated North America. The toolkit is remarkably consistent everywhere you look. It's as though a single people with a single set of ideas spread with explosive speed across a vacant continent. This astonishing uniformity is the heart of the Clovis mystery. For a long time, it was the basis of the Clovis first theory, the idea that these hunters were the very first people to arrive south of the ice sheets, expanding rapidly into an empty paradise. But remember the footprint in Chile, at Monteverde. People were here before Clovis. So the question shifts. Who are the Clovis people really? Were they the descendants of those earlier, pre-Clovis coastal peoples who, after a few thousand years of living in the Americas, invented this powerful new toolkit and then expanded with incredible success? Or were they a new migration wave altogether, a distinct group who came down that ice-free corridor after it opened, bringing their technology with them and replacing or absorbing the sparse populations that already existed? We don't have the answer. The story in the stones is silent on this point. What is clear is that for a brief, brilliant moment in time, the Clovis culture was the undisputed human signature on the land, their fluted points a testament to a people who mastered the art of survival in a world of giants. For a brief, brilliant moment in time, The Clovis people were the masters of their world, a world defined by ice and giants. Their fluted points were the key that unlocked the vast storehouse of protein that walked the Pleistocene plains, and their culture, uniform and widespread, suggests a people confident in their skills and their place in the landscape. But the world they had mastered was already beginning to vanish. The great planetary engine that drives the cycles of ice and warmth was shifting into a higher gear. The bitter cold of the last glacial maximum was losing its grip, and the Earth was beginning to shrug off its immense mantle of ice. The change was not gentle. It was a chaotic and convulsive transformation, a period of profound instability that would not only erase the world of the megafauna, but would also demand a complete reinvention of what it meant to be a human being in America. The ice sheets themselves, those continent-spanning glaciers we remember from the beginning of our story, began a slow and then catastrophic retreat. The melting was not a steady trickle, it was a deluge. Inconceivable volumes of fresh water poured into the oceans, causing sea levels to rise dramatically, swallowing the old coastlines. Inland, the melt created colossal, temporary lakes, some larger than any of the modern Great Lakes. Occasionally, the ice dams holding back these lakes would burst, unleashing biblical floods that scoured the landscape down to the bedrock in a matter of days, carving canyons and reshaping river valleys. The climate became erratic, swinging between warmer, wetter periods and abrupt, shocking returns to near glacial cold, like the younger Dryas period, a 1,000-year cold snap that sent the struggling ecosystems into further disarray. The very ground beneath the hunter's feet was changing. The vast, open mammoth steppe, with its nutrient-rich grasses, began to shrink. In its place, new landscapes emerged. Dense boreal forests of spruce and pine marched northward in the wake of the retreating ice, while in the south, temperate deciduous forests of oak and hickory began to expand. The old, familiar world was being unwritten and rewritten season by season. For the great beasts, this was a disaster. They were specialists, magnificently adapted to the cold, stable conditions of the Ice Age. The woolly mammoths, with their thick, shaggy coats and teeth designed for grinding tough, arid grasses, found their great pasture lands disappearing, replaced by dense forests where their food was scarce. The mastodons, browsers of spruce tips, saw their preferred habitat migrate northwards up faster than their slow reproductive cycles could possibly allow them to follow. Giant sloths, short-faced bears, American lions, dozens of species found their world turned upside down. This leads us to the first great theory of their disappearance: climate change. In this view, the megafauna were simply casualties of a planetary fever. Their habitats fragmented, their food sources vanished, and the chaotic, rapid shifts in weather patterns placed their populations under unbearable stress. They were, in this telling, already walking dead, ghosts in a world that no longer had a place for them. Human hunters in this scenario were merely scavengers at the feast of a dying world, picking off the last of the doomed giants. But there's a deeply unsettling coincidence in the timeline. The great beasts of the Americas had survived many climate shifts before, many cycles of warming and cooling. What was so different about this one? The unsettling answer is, of course, the arrival of people. This brings us to the second theory, the far more dramatic and controversial one, The overkill hypothesis. This theory posits that the Clovis hunters were not just passive witnesses to the extinction, but its primary cause. The megafauna, having evolved for millions of years in a world without a technologically advanced, two-legged predator, would have had no instinctual fear of humans. To a mammoth, a small group of people might have seemed no more threatening than a pack of wolves, a nuisance to be brushed aside. They would not have understood the danger until the first fluted point, thrown with the incredible force of an atlatl, bit deep into their flank. The hunters, spreading with astonishing speed into this naive paradise, would have been a wave of death, a blitzkrieg of stone-tipped spears. This theory paints a grim picture of human efficiency, wiping out species after species as they moved through the hemisphere. The evidence is tantalizingly ambiguous. On one hand, direct proof of this continental slaughter is surprisingly rare. We have a few dozen confirmed Clovis kill sites, mostly involving mammoths and bison. If humans were the primary cause of the extinction of so many species, shouldn't we be tripping over kill sites everywhere we dig? But on the other hand, the pattern of extinction is highly suspicious. It wasn't a random die-off. It was overwhelmingly the large, slow-reproducing animals that vanished. Smaller, faster-breeding animals like deer, pronghorn, and rabbits sailed through the extinction event just fine. This looks less like a random climate event and more like a predator's selective menu. So which is it? Were humans the assassins, or was the climate the killer? The truth, as it so often is probably not found in either extreme. The most likely culprit was a devastating 1-2 punch. The climate delivered the first blow, putting the megafauna on the ropes. Their populations were already stressed, their ranges shrinking, their herds fragmented and weak, and into that world of chaos and vulnerability stepped the Clovis hunter, a predator of unprecedented skill and lethality. They didn't have to kill every last mammoth. They only had to kill them faster than they could reproduce. By targeting pregnant females or young animals, a relatively small number of hunters could have had a catastrophic impact on already struggling populations, pushing them over the precipice into extinction. Whatever the precise cause, the result was the same. Within the span of just a few thousand years, a mere eye blink in geological time, the Americas fell silent. The ground no longer shook from the tread of mammoth herds. The forests no longer echoed with the crash of a browsing mastodon. The giants were gone forever, and for the people who remained, the world was fundamentally and permanently changed. Their entire way of life, a culture built around the pursuit of these magnificent beasts, was now obsolete. The iconic Clovis point, the ultimate tool for hunting giants, was now a solution to a problem that no longer existed. A hunter could stand on a ridge, holding a perfectly crafted spear, and scan a horizon that was now hauntingly, achingly empty. Humanity had survived the end of the Ice Age, but they had inherited a diminished world. They would have to adapt, to innovate, to find a new way to live. Their story was not over. A new chapter was about to begin. The silence on the plains must have been profound. A world that once trembled with the footsteps of giants was now still. For the descendants of the Clovis people, this new, emptier world presented a stark and unforgiving choice: adapt or fade away. The elegant, fluted spear point, so perfectly suited for the epic confrontations with mammoths and mastodons, was now an artifact of a bygone era, a piece of heroic but useless technology. To hunt a deer or a rabbit with such a weapon would have been comical overkill, like using a cannon to swat a fly. The singular focus of the Paleo-Indian hunter, a life dedicated to the pursuit of the great beasts, was a chapter of human history that was now definitively closed. What followed was not a period of decline, but rather a long and deeply creative era of human ingenuity, a testament to the flexibility of the human mind. This new chapter, lasting for thousands of years, is known as the Archaic Period, and it was the time when the people of the Americas truly learned to call the land their home. The shift was from being a specialist to being a generalist. Instead of a single, continent-spanning survival strategy, 1,000 different strategies began to bloom, each one minutely tailored to a specific landscape. The people of the Archaic Period embarked on an intense, millennia-long project of learning the intricate rhythms of their local worlds. They learned to read the subtle language of the plants, the secret habits of the smaller, swifter animals, and the cycles of the rivers and tides. This new, intimate knowledge was reflected in a complete transformation of their toolkit. The singular Clovis point vanished, and in its place appeared a dazzling variety of smaller, more practical projectile points. These new points were designed for a new kind of hunting, tailored for the fleet-footed deer of the eastern forests, the hardy pronghorn of the high plains, and the bighorn sheep of the mountains. Many of these points were notched on the sides or corners, a simple but brilliant innovation that allowed them to be bound much more securely to a spear or dart shaft, creating a more durable and reliable weapon for a world where every hunt mattered. But the real revolution was found in the tools that had little to do with hunting big game at all. For the first time, grinding stones appear in abundance in the archaeological record. Heavy slab-like stones called metates and smaller handheld stones called manos became the essential kitchen implements of the archaic world. Their appearance tells a story of a profound shift in diet. People were now harvesting the tiny, previously overlooked bounties of the plant kingdom, the seeds of wild grasses, the nuts of hickory and walnut trees, the roots and tubers that grew in the earth. These resources were often inedible or difficult to digest raw, but with the patient, rhythmic work of grinding them between two stones, they could be transformed into nutritious, storable flour. Imagine the sound, a sound heard for thousands of years in camps across the continent, the dry, scraping whisper of stone on stone, a sound of sustenance, a sound of foresight, turning the hard, inedible seeds of today into the meal for tomorrow. This single tool represents a fundamental reorientation of human attention, from the spectacular drama of the mammoth hunt to the quiet, patient work of gathering and processing. This diversification continued in every aspect of life. Along the coasts and great river valleys, people became expert fishermen. We find the first delicate curved fish hooks, carved with incredible care from animal bone. We find grooved stones that were used as sinkers to weigh down nets woven from plant fibers. We find barbed harpoon heads for spearing large fish like salmon and sturgeon. People were no longer just terrestrial hunters. They were becoming masters of the aquatic world as well. In the forests, The appearance of heavy, grooved stone axes tells of more sophisticated woodworking. These were not tools for simply breaking branches, but for felling trees, for shaping timbers to build more substantial shelters, and for hollowing out logs to create the first canoes, opening up the rivers and lakes as highways for travel and trade. The world was no longer just a landscape to be walked across, but a place to be settled into, to be shaped and navigated. This new way of life fostered a deep regionalism. The uniform Clovis culture fractured into a mosaic of unique, locally adapted cultures. In the arid Great Basin, people developed a strategy of constant movement, a seasonal round that took them from the valley floors in the spring to the high mountains in the summer, following the ripening plants and the animals that fed on them. Their lives were a marvel of efficiency and deep ecological knowledge. In the lush, deciduous forests of the East, people lived in larger, more settled base camps for parts of the year, scheduling their lives around the autumn nut harvest and the spring fish runs. On the Pacific coast, the sheer abundance of marine life, salmon, seals, shellfish, was so rich that it supported some of the most complex hunter-gatherer societies on Earth, with large, permanent villages, a rich artistic tradition, and a level of social complexity that most of the world wouldn't see until the invention of agriculture. One of the most profound and mysterious shifts during this long era is in how people treated their dead. For the first time, we see the appearance of formal cemeteries, places where generations of people were buried, often with carefully placed grave goods. This suggests something new in the human heart, a growing attachment to a specific territory, a sense of lineage and ancestry tied to a single place. The land was no longer just a hunting ground, it was becoming an ancestral homeland. The bones of the grandmothers and grandfathers were now part of the soil, consecrating it, making it theirs. This was a quiet, internal revolution, but one that laid the foundation for everything to come. For thousands of years, these anonymous, resourceful people built a deep and resilient human presence on the continent, a foundation of knowledge that would prove to be the fertile ground for the next great human experiment. Learning not just to gather plants, but to command them to grow. Over the long, quiet millennia of the Archaic period, the peoples of the Americas became the world's most accomplished botanists. Their survival depended on an encyclopedic knowledge of the plant kingdom, a deep and intimate understanding of which roots were safe to eat, which berries were sweet, which leaves could be used as medicine, and which seeds held the most nourishment. This vast library of knowledge, passed down through countless generations, led to a relationship with certain plants that would slowly, almost imperceptibly, transform from one of passive harvesting to one of active partnership. And in the dry highlands of what is now Mexico, one such partnership with a particularly unpromising wild grass would ignite a revolution so profound that it would change the trajectory of human history on 2 continents. It was a revolution that grew from the ground up, a slow-motion explosion of biological and cultural change that would eventually build cities and fuel empires. The wild ancestor of corn, a plant called teosinte, is not something you would ever look at and see a future of golden, bountiful harvests. It was, to be frank, a scrawny and disappointing little plant. Instead of a single, large cob packed with hundreds of juicy kernels, teosinte produced just a handful of seeds, perhaps 5 to 12 per stalk, and each of these tiny kernels was locked away in a stony, inedible casing as hard as a pebble. To get any nourishment from it, you would have had to smash this casing with a rock. To make matters worse, when the plant ripened, its stalk would become brittle and shatter, scattering these little armored seeds far and wide. For an early forager, it was a plant that seemed to go out of its way to be difficult. It provided very little reward for a great deal of effort. The central mystery, then, is why ancient peoples even bothered with it in the first place. The process of domestication was not an event. It was a conversation between a plant and a people that lasted for thousands of years. It likely began by accident. Archaic foragers, gathering teosinte along with dozens of other wild plants, would have brought their harvest back to their camps. Inevitably, they would have noticed that not all plants were created equal. One plant might, by some random genetic quirk, produce a few more kernels than its neighbor. Another might have a slightly thinner casing on its seeds, making it just a little easier to process. Another's stalk might be a little less brittle, holding on to its seeds for a bit longer. When these people discarded the waste from their meals onto their garbage heaps, or when they deliberately planted a few of the seeds from these superior plants in the fertile ground near their camp, they were doing something revolutionary without even knowing it. They were becoming agents of evolution. They were selecting for desirable traits, creating a feedback loop. The plants that were most useful to humans were the ones whose seeds were most likely to be saved and planted, and thus were the ones to pass on their genes. Slowly, generation by generation, the plant began to change. It was a co-evolutionary dance. The plant, in exchange for its propagation and protection, began to reshape itself to better suit the needs of its new human partners. The rock-hard fruit casing vanished, becoming the soft, pliable inner cob we know today. The brittle, shattering stalk became tough and strong, holding its precious seeds tightly until a human hand came to harvest them. And most dramatically, the number of kernels exploded from a paltry dozen to the hundreds that now march in neat, orderly rows. The plant that emerged from this long process was a new creation, a species that could no longer survive on its own. A modern ear of corn, wrapped tightly in its protective husk, is a biological dead end in the wild. It has no way to disperse its own seeds. It is utterly dependent on the humans who created it. It is less a plant and more a living artifact, a testament to the power of patient, sustained observation and selection. This agricultural revolution wasn't built on maize alone. It was a team effort. Alongside maize, these early farmers domesticated squash and beans, a trio of crops so central to life that they became known to many later cultures as the Three Sisters. Their combination was a stroke of ecological and nutritional genius. The tall, sturdy corn stalks provided a natural trellis for the climbing bean vines to reach for the sunlight. The beans, in turn, performed a chemical miracle. Like all legumes, they capture nitrogen from the air and fix it in the soil, providing a crucial nutrient that the incredibly hungry corn plants need to thrive. And at the base of it all, the broad, sprawling leaves of the squash plants formed a living mulch, shading the ground to retain moisture and choke out the weeds. Together, they created a resilient, self-sustaining garden. Nutritionally, they were a perfect match. providing a balanced diet of carbohydrates from the maize, protein and amino acids from the beans, and vitamins and oils from the squash. The consequences of this agricultural package were staggering. For the first time in human history, people could reliably produce and, more importantly, store a surplus of food. A harvest of dried maize could be stored for years, a buffer against drought, flood, and the uncertainties of the hunt. This food security was the catalyst for a complete transformation of human society. People no longer needed to follow the seasonal migrations of animals or the ripening of wild plants. They could settle down in one place and build permanent villages. A reliable food source fueled a population boom, and villages grew into towns. And with a surplus of food, not everyone needed to be a farmer. This allowed for the rise of specialists, potters who could create vessels to store the grain, weavers, stonemasons, priests who could track the seasons and placate the gods of the harvest, and eventually chiefs and kings who could control the surplus and organize the labor of others. The simple act of saving the best seeds from the harvest was an act of faith in the future, a vote for a different kind of world. It was a bargain. Humanity gained stability but lost mobility. They gained surplus but invited hierarchy. The quiet whisper of the wind through the leaves of a cornfield was the sound of a new social contract being written, a sound that would provide the rhythm for the rise of the first great civilizations of the Americas. The story of agriculture, that slow and patient partnership between humans and plants, is so powerful that it feels like a law of nature. It's the standard model for how civilizations are born. First, people learn to farm a staple crop like maize or wheat. This creates a food surplus, which allows for permanent villages and growing populations. This in turn leads to social complexity, specialization, and eventually the construction of great monuments and cities. It is a neat, logical, and compelling story, and for much of the world it holds true. But while the slow miracle of maize was beginning to quietly transform the highlands of Mexico, something entirely different, and frankly, wonderfully inexplicable, was taking shape in the lush, humid floodplains of North America. Here, in what is now northeastern Louisiana, a group of people decided to skip ahead in the textbook. They built a city of breathtaking scale and complexity, a true marvel of ancient engineering, all without a major agricultural staple to fuel their efforts. They stand as a stunning exception to the rule, a historical enigma that challenges our most basic assumptions about how human societies evolve. The place is called Poverty Point. The name is a modern one, taken from a nearby 19th century plantation, and it does a profound disservice to the ambition and wealth of the people who created it. From the ground, the landscape seems to be just a series of gentle, rolling hills. But from the air, the true, staggering design is revealed. The heart of the site is a massive complex of 6 concentric earthen ridges, arranged in a giant C shape, or perhaps the open end of an octagon. These ridges are enormous. If stretched out in a single line, they would run for over 7 miles. They are not simply piled dirt. They are carefully constructed, rising several feet high and measuring over 100 feet across at their base. The scale of the labor is difficult to comprehend. Archaeologists estimate that it would have taken millions of basket loads of earth, dug by hand and carried to the site, to build these ridges. And this was all accomplished by a society that had no draft animals, no wheel, and no metal tools. Spaced around this central construction are several large earthen mounds, including one of the largest in North America. Known today as Mound A, it is a truly colossal structure, rising over 70 feet into the air. From above, it takes the unmistakable shape of a great bird in flight, its wings outstretched as it soars westward. To build just this one mound required moving a volume of earth that would fill nearly 100,000 modern dump trucks. The engineering was precise, the construction rapid, suggesting a huge and well-organized workforce was mobilized to complete it. And this brings us to the central paradox of Poverty Point. The people who built this were not, by the standard definition, farmers. They were hunter-gatherers, extraordinarily successful hunter-gatherers to be sure, living in one of the richest and most productive environments imaginable. The Mississippi River floodplain was an endless buffet of fish, turtles, waterfowl, deer, and rich plant foods like pecans and acorns. They may have cultivated a few native, starchy plants, but their way of life was not built upon a single, storable grain crop like maize. According to the old rules of archaeology, a society like this should not have been able to build something like Poverty Point. Monumental architecture requires a large, settled population and a significant food surplus to feed the workers who are not out hunting or gathering. How did the people of Poverty Point manage it? How did they organize and feed the thousands of laborers required for such a project? This is the site's enduring mystery, and it has forced us to reconsider the potential of hunter-gatherer societies. One part of the answer seems to lie in the site's role as the hub of a vast, continent-spanning trade network. The stone found at Poverty Point tells a remarkable story of long-distance travel. The heavy stone bowls they used were carved from steatite quarried in the Appalachian Mountains of Alabama and Georgia. The sharp, translucent stone for their finest projectile points came from the Ouachita Mountains in Arkansas and the Ohio River Valley. And most remarkably, copper artifacts found at the site were mined near the Great Lakes, over 1,000 miles to the north. Poverty Point was a magnet, a continental crossroads drawing in raw materials from an area of staggering size. This suggests a society of incredible influence and organizational power, capable of commanding trade and tribute from a vast region. But what was this place for? Was it a bustling city? The ridges are dotted with the remains of post holes, suggesting that hundreds of houses were once built upon them, but it's unclear if people lived here year-round or only gathered seasonally. Was it a grand ceremonial center, a place of pilgrimage where people from many different cultures came to participate in rituals, perhaps centered around the Great Bird Mound and the precise astronomical alignments built into the site's geometry? Or was it, first and foremost, a gigantic trade emporium, a sophisticated marketplace where goods, ideas, and people from all corners of the continent could meet and mingle? The truth is likely a complex blend of all these functions, a type of site for which we have no modern equivalent. It was a place of power, of commerce, and of faith. One of the most common and unique artifacts found there are thousands upon thousands of small, hand-molded balls of baked earth, in shapes from spheres to cylinders to biconical forms. These are known as Poverty Point objects, and they were a clever solution to a local problem. The floodplain lacked good rocks for cooking. These clay balls could be heated in a fire until they were red hot, then dropped into pits lined with hides or into wooden vessels to boil water and cook food. They were, in essence, a form of artificial, reusable stone. After flourishing for several hundred years, around 1100 BCE, Poverty Point was abandoned. The reasons are as mysterious as its creation. There are no signs of conquest, no evidence of environmental disaster. The people simply walked away, and the great earthworks slowly began to soften back into the landscape. Poverty Point is a ghost of a different kind of past, a testament to an alternate path to social complexity. It reminds us that there is more than one way to build a civilization, and that the story of humanity is far richer and far stranger than any simple model can account for. The empty ridges and silent mounds are a profound question mark left on the land, a whisper of a time when hunter-gatherers, for a brief, brilliant moment, built a city of miracles in the Louisiana wetlands. While the ghost of Poverty Point was settling back into the Louisiana soil, a testament to a brilliant but transient cultural experiment, the revolution that had begun in the highlands of Mexico was bearing fruit. The patient, millennia-long conversation between people and plants, especially maize, had created the one ingredient essential for the rise of empires, a reliable, storable food surplus. With this agricultural foundation firmly in place, a new kind of society was now possible, one capable of sustaining large populations, organizing massive labor projects, and supporting a class of rulers and priests. And in the hot, humid, and challenging lowlands along the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, this potential burst into reality. Here, in a land of swamps, jungles, and meandering rivers, the first great civilization of Mesoamerica rose from the fertile earth, a culture so foundational, so influential, that archaeologists would later call them the Cultura Madre, the mother culture. We know them as the Olmec. Their world was a far cry from the dry, mountainous regions where maize was born. The Olmec heartland, centered in the modern Mexican states of Veracruz and Tabasco, is a sultry, tropical landscape, a world of intense green, drenched in rain for much of the year. It's a land teeming with life, where the air is thick with the buzz of insects and the cries of howler monkeys, and the waters are home to crocodiles. The jaguar, a creature of immense power and stealth, was the undisputed apex predator, a silent, spotted king of the jungle night. For the Olmec, this challenging environment was also a source of incredible wealth. The annual floods of the great rivers, like the Coatzacoalcos, deposited layers of rich, black alluvial soil onto natural levees, creating ribbons of prime agricultural land that yielded multiple harvests of maize a year. It was this natural bounty, harnessed by human ingenuity, that fueled their rise. Their first great center, which rose to prominence around 1500 BCE, was San Lorenzo. It was not a city of towering stone pyramids, but something even more ambitious in its own way, an act of pure landscape engineering. The Olmec chose a high point on the floodplain and proceeded to reshape it entirely, moving millions upon millions of cubic feet of earth to create a massive, flat-topped plateau, a sacred mountain of their own making, lifted high above the seasonal floods. Upon this great platform, they arranged their ceremonial buildings and elite residences. They even engineered a sophisticated plumbing system, a network of channels and basins carved from heavy blocks of imported basalt rock, a testament to their incredible organizational power and technical skill. And it was here, at San Lorenzo, that the Olmec would create their most recognizable and awe-inspiring legacy. Erupting from the earth of their sacred sites, staring out across the centuries with a silent, brooding intensity, are the colossal heads. These are among the most magnificent and mysterious sculptures of the ancient world. Carved from single, massive boulders of volcanic basalt, some stand over 10 feet tall and weigh more than a suburban SUV. The stone itself was not local. It had to be quarried in the Tuxtla Mountains, up to 90 miles away. How the Olmec managed to transport these multi-ton blocks through miles of swamp and jungle without the aid of the wheel or draft animals remains a staggering logistical mystery. But even more remarkable than their size is their artistry. These are not generic as idealized faces. Each head is a distinct and powerful portrait of an individual man. The features are rendered with a stunning naturalism: full lips, broad noses, slightly crossed eyes, and a powerful, commanding expression. Each wears a unique, close-fitting helmet or headdress, perhaps the protective gear for a ritual ball game, or a symbol of their rank and lineage. The consensus among scholars is that these are the portraits of mighty Olmec rulers, their authority immortalized in everlasting stone. The artistic genius of the Olmec was not confined to these stone giants. They were masters of working in precious and difficult materials, especially jade and serpentine, stones they prized for their green color, associating it with water, fertility, and life itself. From these stones they carved exquisite figurines, ceremonial axes known as celts, and jewelry. And in this smaller, more intimate art, we find the core of their religious beliefs, dominated by a strange and powerful hybrid creature, the were-jaguar. Again and again, we see this motif: a human figure, often with the pudgy, sexless body of an infant, but with a monstrous, snarling mouth, downturned at the corners, with flared lips and fangs, unmistakably the mouth of a jaguar. This obsessive focus on human-feline transformation likely represents a core belief in their cosmology, perhaps the divine origin of the ruling dynasty from the mythic union of a woman and a jaguar, or the power of shamans and kings to cross the veil between the human and spirit worlds, taking on the strength and fury of their land's most formidable predator. It is this powerful artistic and religious system, along with a host of other innovations, that earns the Olmec the title of Mother Culture. They were the cultural wellspring from which so many later, more famous civilizations, like the Maya and the Aztecs, would draw. The Olmec established the template, the orientation of ceremonial centers, the construction of earthen mounds and pyramids, the deification of rulers who associated themselves with the power of the jaguar. They likely played the first ritual ball game, a tradition that would become a deadly serious obsession across Mesoamerica for the next 3,000 years. And while the evidence is still debated, it is with the Olmec that we may see the first stirrings of writing and the complex calendar systems that would be perfected by their cultural descendants. They were the first to articulate the foundational ideas of Mesoamerican civilization, a unique worldview of gods, kings, and the sacred landscape, a cultural DNA that would be passed down, copied, and elaborated upon for centuries to come, long after their own great centers had been reclaimed by the jungle. Those powerful, stone-faced rulers we met, staring out from their thrones of volcanic basalt, hold secrets far deeper than just their identities. The colossal heads are more than just portraits. They are artifacts of immense human effort and profound ritual meaning. To look upon one is to be confronted by a series of cascading questions, each more difficult to answer than the last. The first and most practical of these enigmas is one of sheer brute force logistics. How, in a world without the wheel, without beasts of burden, without metal tools, did the Olmec quarry transport and carve these monuments to their kings? It is a puzzle of engineering that speaks to a level of social organization and raw manpower that is simply staggering to contemplate. The journey for each stone began high in the Tuxtla Mountains, the nearest source of the volcanic basalt they favored. The Olmec quarry sites are still visible, littered with massive boulders, abandoned partway through the carving process. From there, the chosen block, weighing anywhere from 10 to 50 tons, had to be moved across nearly 90 miles of the most challenging terrain imaginable, a landscape of dense jungle, steep ravines, and swampy lowlands. The prevailing theory suggests a colossal human effort. The great stone was likely maneuvered onto a massive wooden sledge, which was then dragged over a path of rolling logs by hundreds, perhaps even thousands of laborers. When they reached a river, the block and its sledge would have been painstakingly loaded onto enormous rafts made of balsa logs, lashed together, and then guided downriver. Imagine the scene: a flotilla of canoes guiding a floating island of wood that bears a king's stone face, the whole procession powered by sweat, muscle, and a deep, abiding belief in the importance of their task. The amount of food, rope, and sheer social cohesion required to see such a project through, from start to finish, tells us more about the power of Olmec rulers than the portraits themselves ever could. And yet, the mystery only deepens once the heads reached their destination and were carved into their final, majestic form. Because many of them, after presumably sitting in a place of honor for some time, were deliberately damaged and then, even more strangely, carefully buried. Some heads show pockmarks and gashes as if they were attacked. Others have had their features systematically ground down. For a long time, the prevailing theory was one of revolution or conquest. It's a dramatic story. An invading army or an oppressed populace rises up, and in an act of political fury, they topple and deface the images of the tyrants who ruled over them. But this theory of iconoclasm doesn't quite fit with the evidence. The burials of the heads were not haphazard acts of rage. They were careful, deliberate, and deeply respectful affairs. The great stone portraits were laid to rest in prepared pits, often surrounded by offerings, an act of interment rather than desecration. This has led to a more subtle and profound theory, that of ritual termination. In the Olmec worldview, these portraits may have been seen as far more than mere representations. They may have been considered living objects, vessels that contained the life force or spirit of the ruler they depicted. As long as the king was alive and in power, his stone effigy was a conduit for that power. But when the ruler died, the portrait's spirit also needed to be released. The deliberate mutilation, then, was not an act of anger, but a ritual killing of the object, a way to decommission its sacred power. The burial was its final, respectful funeral. This speaks to a world where the lines between a person, their image, and their spirits were fluid and deeply interconnected. The buried heads were not vanquished enemies. They were ancestors, their power now returned to the earth from which all power came. This practice of intentionally burying powerful objects leads us to the second great enigma of Olmec culture, one that takes place at their later, even grander center of La Venta. Here, archaeologists discovered something that defies all modern logic of wealth and art: the massive offerings. Deep beneath the plazas and pyramids of the city, Olmec priests directed the digging of enormous pits, some over 25 feet deep. At the bottom of these pits, they created some of their most beautiful and elaborate works of art, which they then immediately and permanently buried. The most stunning examples are the mosaic pavements. At the bottom of a deep shaft, workers would painstakingly lay out thousands of precisely cut blocks of green serpentine to form a large, abstract, and powerful image, often interpreted as a jaguar mask. This was a masterpiece of design and labor, a priceless expenditure of a rare, imported stone. And the moment it was completed, it was covered over. No human eyes were ever meant to see it. It was an offering made directly to the earth or to the supernatural forces of the underworld. In another part of La Venta, a smaller but no less mysterious scene was unearthed. Known as Offering 4, it is a small diorama. 16 figurines, carved from beautiful jade and serpentine, are arranged in a semicircle. They seem to be witnessing an event. At the center of their attention stands a single taller figure, and behind the main group are 6 slender, upright jade axes, like a row of columns or sacred stones. The entire scene was carefully arranged in a sand-filled pit and buried. Is it a council of elders? A shamanistic ritual? A king receiving tribute? It is a silent, frozen moment of Olmec life, a story whose characters and plot are forever lost to us. Why create these beautiful, intricate things only to hide them from view? It was an act of profound faith, a belief that the cosmos ran on a system of reciprocity. The gods and the earth provided the maize that sustained human life, and in return, humanity had to feed the gods with the most precious things it possessed. The act of burial was the act of feeding. For the Olmec, the ultimate audience for their greatest works of art was not human at all, but the hungry, sacred, and unseen powers of the world below. The Olmec, with their buried jade and colossal stone heads, did not simply vanish into the jungle mist. A culture that powerful does not truly die. It transforms. Its ideas, like seeds scattered from a great tree, were carried by traders, by migrating families, and by the simple, irresistible gravity of a successful way of life. These seeds of civilization, the concepts of divine kingship, of ceremonial centers aligned to the cosmos, of a pantheon of powerful gods, and a reverence for the life-giving color of jade, traveled south and east, taking root in a new and challenging landscape, the dense, triple canopy rainforest of the Petén lowlands in what is now northern Guatemala. Here, among a people who shared a common linguistic root, these Olmec ideas would be cultivated, nurtured, and ultimately transformed into something new, something grander, and something distinctly their own. Here, in the green heart of the jungle, the foundations of the Maya world were being laid. For centuries, starting around 1000 BCE, the first Maya settlements were modest affairs, small villages of thatched huts clustered around simple earthen platforms topped with a temple. Their pottery and small clay figurines showed a clear and reverent debt to their Olmec predecessors. They were learning, adapting, and slowly mastering the difficult art of living in a rainforest. Unlike the river-rich Olmec heartland, the Peten has thin, fragile soils and few major rivers. Survival here required a different kind of ingenuity, a deep understanding of how to manage water and how to coax sustenance from the forest floor. And for a long time, their story was a quiet one. But then, sometime around the 6th century BCE, a new energy seems to surge through the Maya world. The villages began to grow, the ceremonial platforms became more ambitious, and in a remote, swampy basin in the far northern Peten, a cultural explosion occurred. Here, a city of almost unbelievable size and scale rose from the jungle floor, a metropolis that would dwarf any that had come before it in the Americas. It was the first Maya superpower. We call it El Mirador. To speak of El Mirador is to speak in superlatives. It was not a city in the modern sense of a dense grid of streets, but a vast, sprawling urban landscape, a constellation of monumental architectural complexes connected by a web of brilliant white limestone causeways called Sakbiab that sliced through the green jungle. At its height, it was the beating heart of a kingdom, the capital of a state that controlled a network of other cities and towns throughout the region. The sheer scale of its central pyramids is a challenge to the imagination, a testament to the power of its kings to command the labor of thousands upon thousands of their subjects. On the western side of the city's core rose the Tigre complex, a pyramid whose base alone was larger than 3 football fields, crowned with the distinctive triadic pattern of pre-classic Maya architecture, a dominant central temple flanked by 2 smaller ones facing inward, a pattern thought to represent a celestial hearth of creation. But it is the city's other great pyramid, the Danta complex, that truly strains belief. Rising on the eastern edge of the city, Danta is not a single, steep-sided pyramid in the Egyptian style. It is more accurately a man-made mountain range. The Maya built upon a series of natural hills, augmenting and reshaping them with immense stone platforms, creating a multi-leveled acropolis that culminates in a final, soaring triadic temple group at its summit. By total volume, the Danta complex is one of the largest ancient structures in the entire world, containing millions of cubic meters of rock and fill. To stand at its base and look up is to see a stairway to the heavens, a structure designed to overwhelm, to inspire awe, and to leave no doubt as to the power of the kings who communed with the gods from its peak. And all of this was built centuries before the rise of the more famous classic Maya cities like Tikal and Palenque. This was the Maya world's first and perhaps greatest golden age. What kind of society could create such a place? El Mirador was a city of artists and astronomers, of priests who tracked the movements of the stars, and of kings who claimed a divine mandate to rule. We can see the sophistication of their beliefs in the fragments of stunning stucco sculptures that once adorned the pyramids. Here, we find some of the earliest known depictions of the Maya creation story, the Popol Vuh, showing the mythical hero twins Hunahpu, and Exbalanque, swimming in a watery vision of the underworld. This tells us that the core cosmological beliefs that would define the Maya for the next 2,000 years were already firmly in place in this early jungle metropolis. But the story of El Mirador is also a cautionary tale. For all its power and grandeur, it was built on a fragile foundation, and after centuries of dominance, this great kingdom collapsed suddenly and catastrophically. Around the year 150 CE, El Mirador and the other cities of the basin were abandoned. The great causeways fell silent. The plazas, once teeming with people, grew quiet, and the jungle began its slow, relentless work of reclamation. Why? The mystery of the pre-classic Maya collapse is one of the great enigmas of ancient America. There is no single, easy answer. The evidence seems to point to a perfect storm of calamities. The massive construction projects required huge amounts of wood to be burned to create the lime plaster that coated the pyramids, leading to widespread deforestation. This, in turn, may have led to soil erosion and environmental degradation, making their intensive agriculture less productive. Add to this the possibility of a series of prolonged, devastating droughts and perhaps endemic warfare, and you have a recipe for societal collapse. The system became too big, too complex, and it simply broke. The fall of El Mirador left a power vacuum in the Maya world, a kind of dark age that would last for centuries, a silent interlude before the next great flowering of Maya culture would rise. The silent, vine-choked pyramids that loom over the Petén canopy are a haunting reminder that even the greatest kingdoms can be swallowed by the jungle, their stories waiting patiently in the quiet earth. As the great jungle metropolis of El Mirador and its sister cities were being reclaimed by the patient, grasping vines of the Petén, the center of gravity in the ancient American world was making a dramatic shift. The power, wealth, and innovation that had characterized the pre-classic Maya world did not simply vanish. Instead, a new and very different kind of power was coalescing hundreds of miles to the west, in the high, temperate, and fertile valley of Mexico. Here, surrounded by pine-clad mountains and the glittering waters of a great lake, a city would rise that would become the true giant of its age. It was a city built not on the sprawling, organic model of the Maya, but on a rigid, breathtakingly ambitious grid, a city that would become a pilgrimage site, a commercial powerhouse, and a military force that cast a long, mysterious shadow over all of Mesoamerica. Later, the Aztecs, stumbling upon its majestic ruins centuries after its fall, would name it Teotihuacan, the city of the gods, the place where time began. Teotihuacan was not a city that grew slowly and haphazardly. From its very inception, around the time of Christ, it seems to have been conceived on a colossal scale, a deliberate and awesome statement of order imposed upon the natural landscape. At its zenith, around 450 CE, it was one of the largest cities on the entire planet, with a population of well over 100,000 people, a sprawling metropolis covering more than 8 square miles. Its builders laid it out on a precise grid, oriented to a point on the horizon that marked a key astronomical event. The entire city was a machine for tracking time, a map of the cosmos rendered in stone and plaster. The central artery of this great machine was a broad, monumental causeway, misnamed by the Aztecs as the Avenue of the Dead. This was not a street of tombs, but the city's sacred political and commercial heart, a grand processional way that ran for miles through the center of the city, connecting its most important ceremonial complexes. Dominating the entire landscape, standing near the center of the avenue, is the Pyramid of the Sun. It is a structure of almost inconceivable mass, the third largest pyramid in the world, a man-made mountain of earth and stone rising over 200 feet into the sky. Its construction would have required the labor of thousands of workers over many decades. Deep beneath its central point, archaeologists discovered a natural cave, enlarged and shaped into a clover-leaf pattern, which was clearly a place of immense sacred power long before the pyramid was built above it. The pyramid was an act of consecration, an architectural mountain built to seal in and harness the primordial power of the cave below. At the northern end of the avenue stands its slightly smaller but no less majestic counterpart, the Pyramid of the Moon, perfectly framed against the backdrop of a sacred mountain behind it. Cerro Gordo, the Pyramid of the Moon, served as a grand stage for some of the city's most important and most brutal state rituals. Excavations deep within its layers have revealed multiple tombs containing the remains of sacrificed individuals, both human and animal, offerings laid down to sanctify each new phase of the pyramid's construction. Further south along the avenue lay the Citadel, a vast sunken plaza that contained the city's political heart. Here stood the breathtaking temple of the Feathered Serpent, a smaller seven-tiered pyramid decorated with some of the most spectacular sculpture in the ancient Americas. Protruding from its stone facades were hundreds of alternating, masterfully carved heads. One, the undulating form of a serpent adorned with the long, green plumes of the Quetzal bird, the first great monument to the god Quetzalcoatl, and the other, a strange, goggle-eyed being, wreathed in fangs, a powerful storm deity. But this beauty was born of blood. Buried at the pyramid's foundations were the bodies of more than 200 individuals, mostly young men with their hands tied behind their backs, warriors from a foreign land or from within the city itself, sacrificed to dedicate this great temple. Perhaps the most unique feature of Teotihuacan, however, was how its ordinary people lived. Unlike other Mesoamerican cities, where commoners lived in scattered huts, the vast majority of Teotihuacan's population resided in large, single-story, multi-family apartment compounds. These were sprawling, windowless structures, their stone and plaster walls enclosing a labyrinth of rooms, patios, and alleyways, many decorated with vibrant, beautifully preserved murals depicting gods, animals, and priestly processions. This unique urban plan suggests a social structure very different from that of the Maya, perhaps one organized around clans, guilds, or other collective groups. And this leads us to the great overarching mystery of Teotihuacan. We have almost no idea who these people were. The city's art is strikingly impersonal and abstract. Unlike the Maya, who delighted in carving portraits of their kings and writing their names and accomplishments on stone monuments, the Teotihuacanos left behind not a single definitive portrait of a ruler. No royal tombs have ever been found. We do not know their language, what they called their city, or what form their government took. Was it a single powerful king who chose for religious reasons to remain anonymous? Or was the city ruled by a council of elites, a powerful and faceless oligarchy? The city's silence on this point is profound. It was a cosmopolitan place with distinct neighborhoods that housed merchants and artisans from the Maya lands and from the Zapotec kingdom of Oaxaca, like ancient embassies. But the identity of the ruling power that held this great multi-ethnic city together remains a complete enigma. This silent, orderly, and immensely powerful city would exert its influence across hundreds of miles, a mysterious giant whose presence would be felt in the courts of distant Maya kings, a city of gods whose own story was written not in words, but in blood and stone. For centuries, the city of Teotihuacan was a titan, an immovable center of the Mesoamerican world. Its rigid grid was a symbol of cosmic order, its great pyramids a testament to a power that seemed eternal, and its silent, anonymous rulers projected an influence that was felt in the deepest jungles of the Maya and the mountain valleys of Oaxaca. The city was more than a place. It was an idea, an expression of a powerful and unshakable worldview. But the stability was an illusion. The stone and plaster monuments, which seemed to promise permanence, were built upon a foundation of social and environmental pressures that were slowly, invisibly cracking. And around the year 550 CE, the cracks gave way, and the most powerful city in the Americas did not gently fade away. It burned. The end of Teotihuacan was not a quiet, drawn-out decline. It was a singular, catastrophic event, an act of shocking and deliberate violence. The archaeological evidence tells a story of fire and fury. A great conflagration swept through the city, but it was not a wildfire or an accidental blaze. This fire was a strategic and deeply personal attack. The flames were directed with surgical precision at the city's heart, at the very symbols of its power and religion. The great temples that lined the Avenue of the Dead, the palaces of the elite, and the administrative buildings within the citadel were systematically looted, smashed, and set ablaze. Great wooden beams from the temple roofs crashed down into the ceremonial chambers, and the intense heat of the fires baked the plaster walls red and caused the stone to crack and spall. Sacred statues were dragged from their pedestals and shattered. Beautiful murals were defaced. It was a thorough and methodical act of destruction, an effort to not just defeat the city, but to kill its very soul. And yet, the most telling clue is not what was burned, but what was left untouched. While the ceremonial core of the city was a smoldering ruin, the sprawling apartment compounds, where the vast majority of the city's artisans, farmers, and merchants lived, were largely spared from the flames. This was not the indiscriminate destruction of a foreign army who would have had little reason to spare the city's general population. This was an attack that knew its targets, an act of violence that was laser-focused on the ruling class and the state religion. This evidence has led to one of the most compelling and enduring mysteries in ancient American history. Who destroyed Teotihuacan? For a long time, the prevailing theory was that of an external invasion. Perhaps the city's long-suffering rivals, or nomadic warrior groups from the northern frontiers, finally managed to unite, storming the great metropolis and putting its rulers to the sword. But this scenario, while dramatic, doesn't quite fit the evidence. There are few signs of a great battle at the city's edge, and again, it fails to explain the targeted nature of the destruction. The fire seems to have come from within. This has given rise to the theory of a massive internal uprising. Imagine a city buckling under its own weight. Its population of over 100,000 people required immense resources. The surrounding forests would have been stripped bare to provide wood for cooking fires, and more importantly, to be burned into the vast quantities of lime needed for the city's plaster and stucco. This deforestation would lead to soil erosion and desertification, making the land less productive. If a period of prolonged drought were to strike this already stressed agricultural system, the result would be famine. It is easy to picture the city's common people starving and desperate, seeing their prayers go unanswered by the goggle-eyed storm god, finally turning their rage upon the priests and nobles in their palaces, the anonymous rulers who had so spectacularly failed them. The fire, in this telling, was the explosion of a city's long-suppressed fury against its masters. A third possibility is a variation on this theme, a brutal civil war among the city's elite. Perhaps the faceless, collective government we imagine was not so stable after all. Rival noble houses or powerful factions within the oligarchy may have turned on one another in a final, bloody struggle for control. The burning of a rival family's palace or their patron temple would have been a definitive way to eliminate them from the board. In this scenario, the city essentially tore itself apart from the top down, a catastrophic failure of its political system that consumed the entire state in the process. The truth is likely a grim combination of all these factors. A city weakened by environmental degradation and climate change, its people growing restless and hungry, its elites perhaps fracturing under the pressure, becomes a tinderbox. Any spark, a failed harvest, a political assassination, a military defeat on a distant frontier could have been enough to ignite the final city-killing inferno. After the fire, Teotihuacan was a ghost of its former self. A smaller, poorer population of squatters moved in, building crude shelters in the burned-out shells of the once great palaces, scavenging among the ruins. But the central authority was gone. The workshops that produced the city's iconic pottery fell silent. The vast trade networks that had been the city's lifeblood withered and died. The giant of Mesoamerica was dead, and its death left a profound power vacuum. The entire political map of the ancient world was suddenly redrawn. For the Maya kingdoms to the south, the collapse of the great power that had meddled in their affairs for so long was an opportunity. For the cities in the surrounding valleys, it was a time of chaos and conflict. New powers would eventually rise to take Teotihuacan's place, but the era of a single, dominant superpower was over. The smoke rising from the smoldering ruins on the Avenue of the Dead was a signal that a new, more uncertain, and ultimately more violent chapter of Mesoamerican history was about to begin. The smoke that rose from the shattered temples of Teotihuacan was a signal fire that could be seen, metaphorically, across all of Mesoamerica. The collapse of the giant left a gaping hole in the fabric of the ancient world, a power vacuum that ended an era of centralized influence and ushered in a new age of fierce competition and flourishing regionalism. And nowhere was this new energy felt more profoundly than in the southern Maya lowlands. The great jungle cities of the pre-classic period, like El Mirador, had long since fallen silent, but the Maya people had endured. Now, with the shadow of Teotihuacan lifted, a great cultural renaissance began. New cities rose from the jungle floor, grander and more refined than ever before, and for the next 6 centuries, the Maya would create one of the most intellectually brilliant and artistically vibrant civilizations the world has ever known. This was the classic period, the true golden age of the Maya. This new era was defined by the rise of dozens of powerful, competing city-states, each ruled by a line of divine kings. This was not a single, unified Maya empire, but a dynamic and often volatile landscape of kingdoms, a complex political tapestry of shifting alliances, royal marriages, trade partnerships, and intense ritualized warfare. Great cities like Tikal, with its soaring, steep-sided pyramids piercing the jungle canopy, the Serpentine dynasty of Calakmul, the artistically masterful center of Palenque, nestled in the green hills of Chiapas, and the great intellectual capital of Copan in Honduras, all vied for power and prestige. The ruler of each city was a Kuhul Ajap, a holy lord, a title that signified he was far more than a mere political or military leader. He was the divine axis of the state, the shaman in chief, the living conduit between the mortal realm of his subjects and the supernatural world of the gods and ancestors. His most sacred duty was to maintain the cosmic balance through ritual, and the most potent of these rituals was a personal offering of blood. On great ceremonial occasions, the king, adorned in jade, shells, and the iridescent green plumes of the Quetzal bird, would pierce his own body, offering his sacred life force to nourish the gods and ensure the continuation of the world. But the most profound achievement of the classic Maya, the one that truly sets them apart, was their mastery of the written word. They were the only civilization in the pre-Columbian Americas to develop a complete and fully functional writing system, a script as nuanced and capable of expressing the spoken word as any in the Old World. For a long time, their beautiful and complex glyphs were a mystery, thought to be merely symbolic or pictographic. But through a long and brilliant process of decipherment, in the latter half of the 20th century, we learned to read their stories in their own words. The script is a sophisticated logosyllabic system, a clever combination of signs that represent whole words and signs that represent phonetic syllables. With this tool, Maya scribes, esteemed members of the royal court, recorded their world in breathtaking detail. On towering stone monuments, called stelae, erected in the great plazas, they inscribed the histories of their kings, their births, their accessions to the throne, their marriages, their victories in battle, and their deaths. On the stone lintels above temple doorways and on finely painted pottery, they detailed myths and courtly scenes. And in books made of folded bark paper, called codices, they recorded their knowledge of astronomy, prophecy, and religious ritual. The voice of the ancient Maya, once silent, could now be heard again. This literacy was built upon an equally profound understanding of mathematics and the cosmos. The Maya were brilliant astronomers and obsessive timekeepers. They conceived of time not as a single, linear progression, but as an intricate and beautiful meshing of different cosmic cycles. They tracked the 365-day solar year, the 260-day sacred calendar, and the movements of Venus with incredible accuracy. To place events in a grander chronology, they invented the long count, a linear calendar that began from a mythical creation date in what is, to us, 3114 B-cell E, allowing them to date events across millennia with pinpoint precision. This sophisticated timekeeping was made possible by their mathematical genius. They used a base 20 number system, and in a monumental intellectual leap, independently invented the concept of the number 0, which they represented with a stylized shell glyph. The invention of 0 was the key that unlocked the possibility of complex calculations and the vast cyclical architecture of their calendar. Reading the newly deciphered texts revealed that the classic Maya world, once imagined as a peaceful federation of quiet priest astronomers, was in fact a cauldron of political intrigue and dynastic ambition. The central mystery that scholars continue to unravel is the exact nature of this political landscape. It now seems clear that for much of the classic period, the Maya world was dominated by the struggle between two colossal superpowers, Tikal and Calakmul. This was the great rivalry of the age. Most of the smaller kingdoms were eventually pulled into the orbit of one of these two giants, becoming either a loyal vassal or a bitter enemy. Their conflict was a centuries-long Cold War that occasionally erupted into devastating, full-scale battles, a continent-spanning chess match whose moves we are still reconstructing from the glyphs on their monuments. In the plazas of their ruined cities, surrounded by the soaring pyramids and the intricately carved portraits of their divine kings, we can now read the story of this golden age, a world of breathtaking beauty, profound intellectual achievement, and deadly serious politics. In the heart of every great classic Maya city, nestled among the soaring pyramids and the sprawling palaces, lay a long, narrow, and deceptively simple-looking structure of stone. It was an eye-shaped alley, flanked by two high, sloping parallel walls, with a smooth, plastered playing surface in between. This was the ball court, and it was the stage for a spectacle that was part sport, part sacred ritual, and entirely a matter of life and death. The ball game was an obsession that ran deep in the Mesoamerican soul, a tradition inherited from the ancient Olmec and perfected by the Maya into a powerful and brutal public performance. To enter the ball court was to step out of the ordinary world and into a sacred space, a liminal zone where the fate of kings and the order of the cosmos itself were put into play. The game, which the Maya called pits, was played with a solid rubber ball, a remarkable invention of Mesoamerican technology. By mixing latex from the native rubber tree with the juice of the morning glory vine, they created a strong, resilient, and bouncy material, a process of vulcanization discovered thousands of years before it was rediscovered in the modern world. The ball was heavy, weighing up to 9 pounds, and it moved with incredible speed. To be struck by it, unprepared, could break bones or even kill a man. The players were elite athletes, members of the noble class, who entered the court wearing elaborate protective gear. They wore thick, yoke-like belts of leather and wood around their hips, padding on their knees and elbows, and often wore magnificent, feather-crested headdresses that identified their lineage and patron gods. The rules were deceptively simple, but the execution was incredibly difficult. Two teams faced each other across the court, and the primary objective was to keep the heavy ball in play, using only certain parts of the body. Striking the ball with the hands or feet was strictly forbidden. Instead, the players had to launch themselves across the hard-packed floor, twisting and contorting to hit the ball with their hips, their thighs, or their upper arms. The game would have been a breathtaking display of acrobatic skill and brute force, a fast-paced and violent ballet. Points were scored in various ways, perhaps by hitting stone markers set into the walls, or by forcing the opposing team to let the ball touch the ground. The ultimate act of skill, one that likely ended the game immediately, was to hit the solid rubber ball through one of the two large vertical stone rings that were sometimes set high on the walls of the court, a feat so difficult it must have been a truly miraculous and rare event. But to see the ball game as merely a sport is to fundamentally misunderstand the Maya worldview. This was not a pastime for idle entertainment. It was a deeply sacred cosmic drama. The ball court itself was a symbolic representation of the world, a portal to the dark and watery underworld known as Xibalba. The heavy rubber ball was not just a ball, it was a stand-in for the sun, the moon, and the stars. The game, therefore, was a ritual reenactment of the great celestial struggle, the cosmic battle between the forces of light and darkness, life and death. It was a retelling of their most sacred story, the myth of the hero twins, who in the dawning of time descended into Xibalba and defeated the lords of death in a ball game, allowing for the creation of the present world. Every game was a repetition of this myth, a way to ensure that the sun would continue to rise, that the seasons would continue to turn, and that the forces of chaos would be kept at bay. The players were not just athletes, they were actors in a divine play, taking on the roles of gods and heroes. And because the stakes of the game were cosmic, the stakes for the players were ultimate. The ball game was inextricably linked with human sacrifice. Carved stone panels that line the walls of many ancient ball courts leave no doubt about this. They show in graphic detail the moments after a game has concluded, with one of the players being held down while another, often a victorious king, decapitates him. The blood that flows from the victim's neck is shown transforming into serpents and fertile vines, a clear depiction of the belief that this sacred death brought forth new life and nourished the earth. But this clarity leads to the game's deepest and most unsettling mystery. Who exactly was being sacrificed? For a long time, the simple assumption was that the members of the losing team were the ones put to the knife, a punishment for their failure and a grim prize for the victors. This certainly seems to have been the case in some contexts, especially when a game was staged between a victorious Maya king and the captured nobles of a city he had just conquered. In this setting, the game was a form of political theater, a ritualized humiliation of the enemy before their final execution. But there is another, more complex possibility. In some of the most sacred and important ritual games, the sacrifice may not have been a punishment, but a supreme honor. To be chosen to die on the ball court was to follow the path of the gods, to have one's life and death elevated to the level of myth. In this interpretation, it may have been the captain of the winning team who was chosen for this glorious fate, his victory on the court, earning him the honor of becoming the ultimate offering. We may never know for sure, and it is likely that the answer changed depending on the city, the era, and the specific ritual occasion. What is certain is that on the hard plaster floor of the ball court, the lines between sport and ritual, between victory and death, and between the human and the divine became terrifyingly and beautifully blurred. For a moment, let us picture the Maya world at its absolute zenith around the year 750 CE. In the southern lowlands, the great city-states are ablaze with culture and activity. At Tikal, a new king has just dedicated a towering temple pyramid, its roof comb a lacework of stone against the sky. At Palenque, artisans are finishing the intricate stucco reliefs that line the walls of the royal palace. At Copan, astronomers are refining their calculations of the solar year, and in cities all across the Petén, scribes are painting the deeds of their divine kings into bark paper books. The population is booming, the art is sublime, the intellectual achievements are staggering. The civilization of the classic Maya seems to be a permanent and unshakable feature of the world. And yet, within the span of a single human lifetime, it would all begin to unravel. The beating heart of this magnificent world would begin to slow, and then, with terrifying speed, it would stop. The story of the classic Maya collapse is not a tale of a single dramatic battle or a cataclysmic volcanic eruption. It is a quieter, more insidious story, a story that archaeologists read not in a layer of ash, but in a creeping, profound silence that falls over the land. The first sign that something was deeply wrong is written on stone. For centuries, the central act of Maya kingship had been the erection of stelae, stone monuments carved with their portraits and a long count date, anchoring their reigns in the grand sweep of cosmic time. But in the late 8th century, the stelae begin to go dark. One by one, the cities stop recording their own histories. The kingdom of Copan erects its last dated monument in the year 822. At the great city of Tikal, the last stela is dated to 869. After that, the historical record, which had run in an unbroken line for over 1,000 years, simply ends. The kings fall silent. This was accompanied by a complete cessation of all elite activity. The grand construction projects that had defined the Maya cities for generations, the building of new pyramids, the expansion of palaces, the renovation of temples, ground to a halt. The quarries fell quiet, and the sound of the stone carver's chisel was no longer heard in the plazas. At the same time, the populations of the southern lowlands went into a freefall. Evidence from the humble remains of peasant households shows a demographic catastrophe of almost unimaginable proportions. Over the course of about a century and a half, the population of this once teeming region may have declined by as much as 95%. And finally, the ultimate act, abandonment. The great ceremonial centers, the architectural hearts of the Maya world, were systematically deserted. The kings, the priests, the artisans, the farmers, they all walked away, leaving the magnificent cities to be slowly, patiently, and inexorably consumed by the jungle. What could have caused such a complete and catastrophic societal disintegration? The mystery of the classic Maya collapse has haunted scholars for generations, and the old, simple theories of a single cause, a mysterious plague, a devastating hurricane, a peasant revolt, have all been found wanting. The reality, as it is now understood, is far more complex and far more terrifying. The collapse was not a single event, but a systemic failure, a perfect storm of interlocking crises that overwhelmed the ability of the Maya to cope. It was a civilization that died by 1,000 cuts. The first wound was self-inflicted. The inscriptions from the late classic period reveal a world of endemic and increasingly brutal warfare. The old, ritualized conflicts between kings were escalating into something far more destructive. The great rivalry between the superpowers of Tikal and Calakmul and their respective networks of allies had destabilized the entire region, creating a state of perpetual conflict. This constant warfare drained resources, destroyed crops, and disrupted trade routes, putting the entire system under immense strain. The second wound came from the earth itself. The booming population and the Maya elite's obsession with monumental construction had pushed their fragile rainforest environment to its breaking point. To create the tons of lime plaster needed to coat their towering pyramids, they had to burn immense quantities of green wood, leading to massive deforestation. This, in turn, led to soil erosion and the loss of agricultural fertility. The very act of building their glorious civilization was slowly poisoning the land that sustained it. And then came the final killing blow: drought. High-resolution climate data extracted from the sediment layers of nearby lakes and from ancient stalagmites in caves has revealed a grim coincidence. The period of the Maya collapse, from roughly 800 to 950 CE, corresponds precisely with a series of the most severe and prolonged droughts the region had seen in thousands of years. For a civilization whose agriculture was entirely dependent on rainfall, this would have been an unmitigated disaster. The rains failed, the crops withered in the fields, and the reservoirs in the great cities ran dry. It is here that all the factors converge into a deadly feedback loop. The drought-induced famine would have caused widespread social unrest, and the people would have looked to their divine kings, the holy lords whose primary job was to mediate with the gods and ensure the rains came. When the kings performed their sacred rituals of bloodletting and sacrifice, and still the skies remained cloudless, their authority would have crumbled. Desperate kings, their legitimacy shattered, likely responded in the only way they knew how: by escalating warfare against their neighbors to seize what few resources remained, a strategy that only deepened the crisis. The delicate political and economic system, already weakened by war and environmental degradation, was simply shattered by the relentless pressure of the drought. The center could not hold. The institution of divine kingship had failed. And so, the people voted with their feet. They abandoned the cities, they abandoned their kings, and they abandoned the very idea of the classic Maya state, melting back into the landscape to find a new, more sustainable way to live. The great plazas fell silent. The stucco masks of the gods crumbled from the temple walls, and the howler monkeys and the jaguar returned to reclaim the empty thrones of the divine kings. The great unraveling of the classic period left a world of ghosts. In the south, the magnificent Maya cities were surrendering to the jungle, their plazas silent and their royal courts empty. In the central highlands of Mexico, the charred ruins of Teotihuacan stood as a grim monument to a fallen giant. The old certainties were gone. The divine kings of the Maya had failed to bring the rain, and the anonymous oligarchs of Teotihuacan had failed to hold their city together. The centuries that followed this widespread collapse, an era we now call the post-classic period, were a time of chaos, of migration, and of profound change. It was a harder, more cynical age, a time when the old gods seemed distant and new, Fiercer deities rose to prominence, demanding a new kind of devotion. Into this power vacuum, a new people emerged to claim the mantle of leadership in central Mexico, a formidable group of warriors who would build a new capital, create a new militaristic art style, and leave behind a legend so powerful that it would shape the destiny of the region for centuries to come. They were the Toltecs. They established their capital around the year 950 CE on a defensible ridge in the state of Hidalgo, a city they called Tolan, which we know today as Tula. These were not the master planners of Teotihuacan. Tula was not laid out on a grand cosmic grid, but it was an impressive city in its own right, and its art and architecture immediately announced a dramatic shift in the cultural mood. While Teotihuacan's art had been abstract and priestly, Tula's was aggressive and martial. At the heart of the city, they built walls, called Coatapantli or serpent walls, decorated with terrifying, repeating friezes of prowling jaguars, coyotes, and eagles, all shown clutching bleeding human hearts in their mouths and beaks. The message was unambiguous. This was a state built on the power of the warrior and sustained by the ritual of human sacrifice. The most iconic and breathtaking expression of this new warrior ideology stood atop the city's main pyramid, known as Pyramid B. Here, a great temple once stood, its roof supported not by simple pillars, but by some of the most famous sculptures in all of ancient America, the Atlantean warriors of Tula. These are 4 colossal columns, each nearly 15 feet tall, carved from basalt and assembled in sections, each one a portrait of an idealized Toltec warrior. They stand at rigid attention, their faces stern, anonymous, and implacable. They are adorned not with the jade and flowing robes of a priest, but with the grim regalia of war. They wear feathered headdresses, sandals, and on their chests, a stylized butterfly pectoral, a potent symbol believed to represent the soul of a warrior slain in battle. On their backs, they carry their weapons, a bundle of darts and an atlatl, the deadly spear thrower that was the signature weapon of the era. These were the guardians of the Toltec state, the stone embodiments of a military order that was the foundation of their power. This new, aggressive state was also the source of one of Mesoamerica's most enduring legends, a story that would be told and retold by the Aztecs centuries later. It is the tale of Tula's greatest and most tragic king, a man named Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl. In the legend, he was a priest king, a devotee of the peaceful, feathered serpent god, who brought an age of unparalleled splendor to Tula, a time when cotton grew in different colors and the corn grew as large as a man. He forbade human sacrifice, encouraging instead offerings of flowers, jade, and butterflies. But his piety earned him a powerful enemy, the dark sorcerer god Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, a deity who craved the nourishment of human hearts. Through trickery and black magic, Tezcatlipoca shamed the pure Quetzalcoatl, getting him drunk and causing him to break his priestly vows. Dishonored, the great king was driven from his beloved city of Tula. He journeyed east to the coast of the Great Sea, where he set himself alight on a funeral pyre, his heart rising into the sky to become the morning star. But he vowed that one day, in a year of cosmic significance, he would return from the east to reclaim his throne. It was a prophecy that would lie dormant for 500 years, waiting for a fateful encounter. And yet, For all the power of their art and the richness of their legends, the Toltecs present us with a profound historical puzzle, a mystery known as the Toltec problem. The later Aztecs, who would build the final great empire of Mesoamerica, absolutely revered the Toltecs. In the Aztec mind, Tula was a semi-mythical paradise, and the word Toltec became a synonym for master artisan or civilized person. The Aztec emperors went to great lengths to claim that they were the direct descendants of the Toltec royal line, using this supposed lineage to legitimize their own rule. Their legends painted the Toltec Empire as a vast and powerful entity that had dominated all of central Mexico. The problem is that the archaeological reality of Tula does not seem to match this legendary reputation. While Tula is an impressive site, it is significantly smaller and appears to have been far less influential than the ruined city of Teotihuacan had been. So who were the Toltecs really? Were they truly the masters of a great empire whose power the Aztecs remembered correctly? Or were they a more modest, regional power whose fame and accomplishments were dramatically exaggerated by the Aztecs for their own political purposes? A third possibility is that the Aztecs, coming upon the ruins of the truly massive Teotihuacan, conflated it with the later Tula, creating a composite, legendary Tolan that was far grander than any historical reality. We may never know for sure. The stone warriors of Tulas stand today as silent witnesses to this mystery, a bridge between history and myth, the last great power of the highlands before the coming of the Aztecs. While the formidable Toltec warriors were building their capital at Tula, their legends echoing through the high valleys of Mexico, a completely independent and equally dramatic story of civilization was unfolding far to the north in the heart of another great river valley. Our story now travels across the Gulf of Mexico, leaving the world of jaguar gods and feathered serpents behind, and moves up the winding, muddy course of the Mississippi River. Here, in a wide, incredibly fertile floodplain in what is now southern Illinois, a new culture was about to experience a cultural Big Bang, a sudden and explosive leap into urbanism and complexity. This was the world of the Mississippians, and their capital was a city that, at its peak, was larger, more populous, and more powerful than London was at the same time. It was a sprawling, bustling metropolis of earthen pyramids, a place we now call Cahokia. The tradition of building great mounds of earth was an old one in North America, a practice stretching back thousands of years to those enigmatic hunter-gatherers at Poverty Point. But at Cahokia, this ancient tradition was supercharged by the full-scale adoption of a crop we remember from Mesoamerica, maize. The arrival of this highly productive and storable grain in the rich, silty soil of the Mississippi floodplain, a region known as the American Bottom, was the catalyst that made a city like Cahokia possible. Around the year 1050 CE, something dramatic happened. A site that had been a modest collection of villages suddenly transformed, seemingly overnight, into a planned and massive city. This rapid urbanization suggests the arrival of a powerful, charismatic leader or a new, compelling religious ideology that united the people and mobilized them for a project of incredible ambition. At its zenith, Cahokia was a true metropolis. It covered nearly 6 square miles and was home to as many as 15,000 people within the city core, with tens of thousands more living in satellite farming villages that stretched for miles in every direction. It was, without question, the largest and most complex city to ever arise north of Mexico. The heart of the city was a vast, 400-acre sacred precinct, at the center of which stood the most massive earthen structure in the Americas, a colossal, four-terraced platform mound known today as Monk's Mound. Its base is larger than that of the Great Pyramid at Giza. It rises 100 feet into the air, a man-made mountain of earth built basket load by painstaking basket load over the course of centuries. On its flat summit, a huge wooden building, perhaps 50 feet high and the size of a modern hockey rink, would have stood the palace of the paramount chief, the temple of the city's most important gods, and the literal and spiritual center of the entire Mississippian world. From the base of Monk's Mound stretched a huge 40-acre grand plaza, a perfectly flat, artificially leveled field where the city's inhabitants would gather for great ceremonies, for games, and for trade. Surrounding this sacred core was a formidable 2-mile-long defensive wall, a palisade of thick wooden logs, complete with watchtowers, a clear indication that for all its grandeur, Cahokia existed in a world where the threat of warfare was very real. And just to the west of Monk's Mound, the Cahokians built a great solar calendar, a large circle of sacred red cedar posts that archaeologists have nicknamed Woodhenge. From the center of this circle, a priest could watch the sun rise and precisely mark the solstices and equinoxes, the key dates that governed their agricultural and ceremonial year. This was a highly stratified society, a pyramid of power as steep as the sides of Monk's Mound itself. At the apex was the paramount chief, a ruler who was likely seen as a living god, a brother of the sun. Below him were his elite relatives, priests and nobles who lived within the sacred precinct, and below them were the vast majority of the population, the farmers, artisans, and laborers whose work supported the entire system. But what was the nature of the chief's power? This question leads us to the city's deepest mystery, a story told in a small, unassuming mound known as Mound 72. Here, archaeologists unearthed one of the most spectacular and grisly burials ever found in North America. The central figure was a man of about 40, a powerful chief or shaman, laid to rest on a cape or blanket made of over 20,000 exquisitely crafted marine shell beads, arranged in the distinct shape of a falcon, a powerful symbol of a warrior. But he was not buried alone. Around him lay the evidence of a truly staggering ritual of sacrifice. In one pit lay the bodies of more than 50 young women, all between the ages of 18 and 23, who had all been sacrificed at the same time. In another, the remains of 4 men were found, their heads and their hands cut off. Nearby were other mass graves, all part of the same funereal event. Mound 72 is undeniable proof that the rulers of Cahokia held the absolute power of life and death over their subjects. But was this power projected outward? Was Cahokia the capital of a vast, coercive empire that dominated the Mississippi Valley through military force? Or was it more like a holy city, a pilgrimage site whose power was religious and cultural, drawing in tribute and people through the sheer force of its sacred charisma? The evidence is ambiguous. We see Cahokian-style pottery and artifacts spread over a vast area, but we are not sure if these were the goods of a conquering army or the souvenirs of devout pilgrims. After 2 centuries of dominance, Cahokia began to decline. By 1350, It was all but abandoned, long before any Europeans reached the continent. The reasons are still debated, but they are likely a familiar litany of overpopulation, deforestation, and political instability. The great city was left to the wind and the rain, its story forgotten, its magnificent earthen mounds slowly softening, becoming just another series of hills in the American landscape. Our story now makes another great journey, leaving behind the green, humid, and forgotten plains of Cahokia and traveling far to the southwest. We move into a different world, a stark and beautiful landscape of red rock, deep canyons, and vast, empty skies. This is the high desert of the Four Corners region, where the modern states of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah meet. It is a land of profound silence and dramatic beauty, but it is also a difficult and unforgiving place to live. Water is scarce and precious, the sun is relentless, and the soil is thin. Survival here requires a different kind of genius, not one of commanding massive river floodplains, but one of patience, of careful observation, and of a deep, spiritual connection to the cycles of the sun, the moon, and the precious, infrequent rain. Here, a people we call the ancestral Puebloans would create one of the most unique and enigmatic cultural expressions in all of ancient America. For centuries, these people had lived as skilled dryland farmers, growing maize, beans, and squash in small villages scattered across the mesas and canyon floors. But around the year 850 CE, a new energy began to coalesce in a 10-mile stretch of remote desert canyon in northwestern New Mexico became the sacred and political center of their world. This was Chaco Canyon. For reasons that are still not fully understood, this specific place became the focus of a monumental building boom that would last for 300 years, transforming it into the heart of a complex and widespread society. The ancestral Puebloans here did not build with earth or wood, but with the stone that was the very bones of their world, and they built on a scale that was both magnificent and deeply mysterious. The canyon is home to a series of immense, multi-storied structures that are rightly called great houses. The largest and most famous of these is Pueblo Bonito, a Spanish name meaning beautiful town. It is a masterpiece of planning and masonry. The structure is a vast, D-shaped apartment complex, covering 3 acres and rising 4, perhaps even 5 stories in some places. It contained over 600 rooms, all precisely laid out and constructed with an exquisite technique of core and veneer stonework, creating beautiful and durable patterned walls. The complex was carefully designed, with its main wall aligned perfectly to the east-west axis of the sun. Woven throughout the great house and throughout all of Chaco's ceremonial architecture are dozens of circular, subterranean rooms called kivas. These were sacred chambers, entered from the roof by a ladder, which served as symbolic portals to the underworld, from which in their cosmology the first ancestors had emerged. But here we encounter the central mystery of Chaco Canyon. Despite the hundreds of rooms in Pueblo Bonito and the other great houses, there is very little evidence that many people actually lived here year-round. Most of the rooms lack the hearths and the typical debris of daily domestic life. The monumental architecture seems wildly out of scale with the small number of permanent residents the canyon could have supported. So what was this place for? The leading theory is that Chaco was not a city in our modern sense, but a great ceremonial center, a place of pilgrimage, a kind of Jerusalem for the ancestral Puebloan world. The great houses were not apartment buildings, but grand, sacred hotels, storehouses for ritual wealth, and temples for the clans and communities who would travel from hundreds of miles away to gather here for key ceremonies throughout the year. This idea is strengthened by another of Chaco's remarkable and enigmatic features: a vast network of engineered roads that radiate out from the canyon in strikingly straight lines. These are not simple winding trails. They are broad avenues, sometimes 30 feet wide, that were excavated, leveled, and run for dozens of miles across the desert, often ignoring the natural topography. They climb sheer cliff faces via carved stairways and hold their straight course with an almost fanatical precision. These roads do not seem practical for simply moving goods. They feel symbolic, like sacred processional ways designed to channel pilgrims from the outlying communities, known as Chacoan outliers, toward the powerful spiritual vortex of the Central Canyon. The people of Chaco were masters of observing the sky. Their entire world was built in harmony with the movements of the sun and moon. Not only were the great houses themselves aligned to key solar and lunar events, but they also created more subtle and beautiful astronomical observatories. The most famous is the Sun Dagger petroglyph, located high on a butte overlooking the canyon. Here, behind three massive, carefully placed slabs of fallen rock, is a spiral carved into the cliff face. It is a celestial clock of stunning precision. On the day of the summer solstice, at high noon, a single, slender sliver of sunlight passes between the slabs and pierces the very heart of the spiral. At the winter solstice, two daggers of light appear and perfectly frame the spiral on either side. It is a silent, beautiful, and profound testament to a people who watch the sky with such patience and reverence that they could mark the turning of the seasons with a simple dance of sunlight and shadow. After 3 centuries of being the center of the Puebloan world, the power of Chaco Canyon began to wane. Around the year 1150, a severe 50-year drought settled over the region, likely shattering the delicate agricultural balance that had made the great gatherings possible. The construction stopped, and the canyon was slowly, deliberately abandoned. The people who had built it did not vanish. They dispersed, migrating to new homes, founding new communities, including the spectacular cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde, carrying the memory and the sacred traditions of Chaco with them. Today, the great houses stand empty, their beautiful stone walls bleached by the sun. The rooms are silent, a haunting monument to a society that created a spiritual capital of cosmic order in the heart of the American desert. Let us now leave the silent, sun-baked cities of the ancestral Puebloans and travel back south, back to the heart of Mexico. The world we return to is the one left behind by the Toltecs, a landscape of competing city-states scattered around the Great Lakes of the Central Valley. Tula's power had faded, but its legend lingered, and every petty king of every small kingdom now claimed to be the rightful heir to the Toltec legacy. It was a crowded, quarrelsome, and ancient world, a place of established dynasties and sophisticated courts. And into this world, sometime in the 13th century, a new group of people arrived. They were a ragtag, semi-nomadic tribe from the north, speaking the Nahuatl language like many in the valley, but they were seen as uncivilized, as crude upstarts and unwelcome intruders. They were a people with no land, no great lineage, and no powerful allies. They had only two things: an unshakable belief in their own destiny and a terrifyingly demanding God. They called themselves the Mexica. Their story, as they would later tell it, began in a mythical, half-remembered homeland far to the north, a place called Aztlan, the place of whiteness, or the place of herons. In their legends, it was an island in a lake, a kind of paradise lost. The historical reality of Aztlan is one of the great mysteries of this era. Was it a real place, perhaps in northern Mexico, or even the American Southwest, whose location has been lost to time? Or was it a purely symbolic homeland, a mythical starting point created by the Mexica after they became powerful, to give themselves an origin story as grand as those of the older, more established peoples of the valley? We will likely never know for sure. What is certain is that from this place of origin, whether real or imagined, the Mexica began a great pilgrimage. They did not leave Aztlan by choice. They were commanded to go by their patron deity, their tribal god, who would guide them and protect them on their journey. His name was Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird on the left, and he was not one of the ancient established gods of Mesoamerica. He was a young, fierce, and uniquely Mexica god of the sun and of war. The legends say that he spoke to his chosen people through their priests, making a divine promise. If they would leave their home and follow his guidance, he would lead them to a new land, a promised land where they would find glory. He told them they would become the rulers of the world, that all other peoples would become their subjects and tributaries, and that their sacred duty would be to nourish him, the sun, with the precious blood of their enemies. And so began a journey that, according to their own chronicles, would last for 200 years. This was not a direct march to a known destination. It was a long and wandering ordeal, an epic of migration that was designed to forge the Mexica into Huitzilopochtli's chosen people. They carried their god with them in a sacred bundle, a tlaquimiloli, and at each new settlement they would build a small shrine for him. It was a difficult journey, filled with hardship, internal strife, and battles with other tribes. But with every challenge, their devotion to their god and their identity as a single, resilient people grew stronger. They were not just traveling through the landscape, they were being tempered by it, hardened into the fierce and disciplined tribe that their god demanded they become. When they finally arrived in the sophisticated and crowded Valley of Mexico, they were met with scorn and suspicion. The established city-states, like the powerful Tepanecs of Azcapotzalco and the noble Colhuas of Culhuacan, who traced their lineage directly back to the great Toltecs, looked down upon the Mexica as crude barbarians. For decades, the Mexica were forced to live on the margins of this world, settling on the worst pieces of land and hiring themselves out as fierce but disposable mercenaries in the endless wars between the city-states. They were a people without a home, wanderers living in the shadow of their powerful neighbors. In one famous episode, they tried to secure an alliance with the king of Culhuacan, who granted them one of his daughters to be married to a Mexica leader and treated as a goddess. In a catastrophic misunderstanding of diplomacy and a supreme act of devotion to their own gods, The Mexica sacrificed the princess and flayed her skin. When the king of Culhuacan arrived to honor his daughter, he was met by a Mexica priest dancing in her skin. Enraged, the Colhuas drove the Mexica out, chasing them into the swamps and reed beds of the great lake Texcoco. It was here, pushed to the brink, living as outcasts on the marshy edges of the lake, that their god's promise was finally fulfilled. Huitzilopochtli had given them a sign to look for, a prophecy that would mark the end of their long journey. He had told them they would find their promised land at a place where an eagle was perched on a nopal cactus, devouring a serpent. And in the year of Two House, which corresponds to our year 1325, the Mexica priests, exploring a small, muddy, snake-infested island in the middle of the lake, finally saw the prophesied sign. For any other people, this would have been a miserable, inhospitable patch of swamp. But for the Mexica, it was destiny. This was the place their God had chosen for them. Here, on this unpromising island, they began to build their city, driving wooden piles into the soft lake bed to create a foundation. They called it Tenochtitlan, the place of the fruit of the prickly pear cactus. It was a humble, difficult beginning, but the long pilgrimage was over. They were finally home from their humble, unpromising beginning on a swampy island that nobody else wanted. The Mexica people, who would soon be the heart of the Aztec Empire, began a project of urban engineering that stands as one of the most audacious and brilliant in human history. They were surrounded by enemies, and their foothold on the world was a patch of mud and reeds in the middle of a great lake. But instead of seeing the water as an obstacle, they saw it as a defense and a resource. They did not fight the lake. They made a partnership with it, and through 2 centuries of relentless toil, ingenuity, and an unshakable sense of their own divinely ordained destiny, they would transform their muddy refuge into a breathtaking metropolis of canals and pyramids, a city so grand and beautiful that the first Europeans to lay eyes on it would wonder if they were dreaming. This was Tenochtitlan. The first challenge was simply to build on the soft, waterlogged ground. The Mexica became master engineers, driving thousands upon thousands of wooden piles deep into the lake bed to create stable foundations for their temples, palaces, and homes. They dredged the canals, using the mud to build up the land, slowly expanding their island. They mastered the water, creating a city that was a perfect fusion of land and lake, earning it the nickname the Venice of the New World. A vast network of canals served as the city's streets, constantly bustling with the traffic of thousands of canoes. Some were humble fishing boats, others were large vessels piled high with produce from the mainland, and still others were the ornate barges of the noble class. To connect their island capital to the shores of the lake, they built 3 massive and wide stone causeways, running for miles to the north, south, and west. These were marvels of engineering, equipped with sections that could be removed and replaced with wooden bridges, allowing them to instantly cut the city off from any invading army. Perhaps their most brilliant innovation was how they fed their enormous and growing population. On the shallow edges of the lake surrounding the city, they created an ingenious and incredibly productive agricultural system. They built chinampas, which are often called floating gardens. though in truth they were more like artificial islands. They would weave great mats of reeds, anchor them to the lake bed with wooden stakes, and then pile rich, fertile mud dredged from the bottom of the lake on top. To stabilize these new plots of land, they planted willow trees at the corners, whose roots would firmly anchor the Shinapa in place. The result was a network of long, rectangular, and unbelievably fertile garden plots separated by canals. The mud was rich in nutrients, and the proximity to the water meant they were perfectly irrigated, allowing for up to 7 different harvests a year. The Chinampas were the agricultural engine that fed the city, a perfect solution to the problem of farming on a lake. At its height in the early 16th century, Tenochtitlan was one of the largest and most orderly cities in the world. As one approached from the mainland, the first sight would be the whitewashed adobe walls of the commoners' houses, lining the canals and the green checkerboard of the Chinampas. Deeper within the city were the larger multi-room stone palaces of the nobility, often built around a central courtyard. But all of this was oriented toward the city's heart, its spiritual and political core, the great sacred precinct. This was a massive, walled enclosure at the very center of the city, a space filled with dozens of temples, priest quarters, a ball court, and a terrifying public display called the Tsompantli, a huge rack that held the skulls of thousands of sacrificial victims. And dominating this entire sacred space, and indeed the entire city, was the Templo Mayor, the great temple of Tenochtitlan. This was not just a temple, it was the center of the Aztec cosmos, the man-made sacred mountain Coatepec, where their patron god had been born. It was a massive, steep-sided double pyramid with 2 grand staircases running up its face. At its summit stood 2 temples. One, painted a brilliant blue and dedicated to Tlaloc, the ancient and revered god of rain, water, and agriculture, the lifeblood of their economy. The other, painted a stark and bloody red, was dedicated to their own fierce tribal god, Huitzilopochtli, the god of the sun and of war, the source of their imperial power. This dual shrine perfectly encapsulated the Aztec worldview. Their empire was sustained by the 2 pillars of farming and military conquest, by water and by blood. But for all of its splendor, the true and complete image of Tenochtitlan is lost to us, and this is its great mystery. The Spanish conquistadors who arrived in 1519 left breathless accounts of the city, describing its cleanliness, its order, and its sheer beauty. But after a brutal and destructive siege, they systematically dismantled the Aztec capital, using the stones from the ruined temples and palaces to build their own colonial capital, Mexico City, directly on top of the ruins. This deliberate act of cultural erasure means that the full glory of Tenochtitlan can now only be glimpsed. Our vision of it is a beautiful but fragile reconstruction, pieced together from the biased accounts of its conquerors, from the few surviving Aztec books, and from the tantalizing archaeological discoveries that are made whenever a new subway line or a construction project in the heart of modern Mexico City accidentally punches through the pavement of the present and into the sacred ground of the past. To live in the magnificent city of Tenochtitlan was to live at the very center of the universe. The city itself, as we have seen, was a physical manifestation of this belief, a sacred map rendered in stone and water. But this cosmic centrality came with a profound and terrifying responsibility. The people who inhabited this brilliant metropolis, from the humblest farmer to the most powerful emperor, were bound together by a shared worldview, a complex and beautiful, yet undeniably brutal, understanding of their place in the cosmos. For the Aztecs, the universe was a fragile and violent place, and they, as the chosen people of the sun god, had been given a single, solemn, and unrelenting mission: to keep the world from ending. Aztec society was a highly ordered and stratified pyramid, a social structure as steep as the stairs of the Templo Mayor. At the very apex was the emperor, the Tlatoani, or he who speaks, a semi-divine figure who was the conduit between the people and the gods. Below him was the noble class, the Pipiltin, who served as the empire's priests, generals, judges, and high-ranking administrators. The vast majority of the population belonged to the commoner class, the Matehualtan, who were organized into land-holding clans called Calpuli. These were the farmers who worked the chinampas, the artisans who created brilliant featherwork and pottery, the merchants who traveled to the farthest corners of the empire, and the foot soldiers who made up the bulk of the Aztec army. But regardless of their station, every person was a participant in the state's great, all-consuming religious project. To understand this project, one must understand their story of creation. The Aztecs believed that the universe was not a permanent creation, but a cyclical one. 4 times before, they believed, the world had been created, and 4 times it had been destroyed, each age or sun ending in a different cataclysm. They were living in the age of the 5th sun, an era that had been set in motion by a final, supreme act of divine sacrifice. In their myths, the gods had gathered in the darkness at the sacred site of Teotihuacan, and 2 of them had thrown themselves into a great fire to become the new sun and moon. But even after this sacrifice, the new sun did not move. It hung motionless in the sky until the other gods gave their own lives, their own blood, to give it the energy to begin its journey across the heavens. This was the cosmic debt that defined the Aztec worldview. Their world was born from the sacrifice of the gods, and their sun god, their patron Huitzilopochtli, was engaged in a constant daily struggle. Every evening as the sun set, he would have to battle the forces of darkness, his sister the moon, and his brothers the stars, to find the strength to be reborn in the morning. This cosmic battle was exhausting, and it required a constant source of the most powerful fuel imaginable. That fuel was chalchihuatl, or precious water, the Aztec term for human blood. Human sacrifice, therefore, was not seen as an act of cruelty or murder. It was the highest and most necessary of all ritual duties. It was the repayment of the debt to the gods. It was the act of feeding the sun, of giving him the strength to win his nightly battle, and of ensuring that the 5th sun would not collapse into the eternal darkness and chaos that was always waiting at the edges of the world. This belief animated the entire Aztec state. Wars were fought not just for territory and tribute, but for a steady supply of captives to be sacrificed. A special kind of ritualized conflict, known as a flower war, was even arranged between the Aztecs and their rivals, where the goal was not to kill the enemy on the battlefield, but to capture him alive and bring him back to Tenochtitlan for this higher, more honorable purpose. To be a warrior captured in a flower war and sacrificed upon the Templo Mayor was considered a glorious and noble death, a destiny that ensured a blessed afterlife in the company of the sun god himself. The ritual itself was a grand public spectacle. The victim would be painted and adorned, treated as a manifestation of the god himself, before being led up the steep steps of the great temple. There, at the summit, before the shrine of Huitzilopochtli, he would be held down over a stone altar, and a priest would use a razor-sharp obsidian knife to swiftly cut open his chest and offer his still-beating heart to the sun. But what was the true scale of this practice? This remains one of the most debated mysteries of the Aztec world. The Spanish conquistadors, horrified by what they saw, wrote of sacrifices on an almost industrial scale, claiming, for instance, that over 80,000 prisoners were sacrificed for the rededication of the Templo Mayor in 1487. For a long time, these numbers were taken at face value, but modern historians and archaeologists are deeply skeptical. The sheer logistics of sacrificing, processing, and disposing of so many bodies in a single 4-day festival seem all but impossible. While there is no doubt that human sacrifice was a central and large-scale part of Aztec life, the archaeological evidence of this is undeniable. The numbers recorded by the Spanish were likely vastly exaggerated, a piece of political propaganda designed to portray the Aztecs as inhuman monsters and to justify the brutalities of the conquest. The true numbers were certainly in the thousands per year, a shocking and terrible figure, but perhaps not the almost unbelievable figures of the Spanish accounts. And so we are left with the central chilling paradox of Aztec civilization, a people of incredible artistic sensitivity, of deep philosophical thought, and of brilliant engineering skill, who built their magnificent world upon the foundational belief that for the sun to rise tomorrow, a human heart had to be offered today. Our story, for so long rooted in the jungles, high valleys, and lake-bound cities of Mesoamerica, now makes a great leap. We must leave the world of the Aztecs and their sun god behind and travel far to the south, following the great spine of the Americas until we arrive in an entirely different and even more dramatic theater of civilization. This is the Andean world of South America, a landscape of breathtaking verticality and extreme contrasts. Here, a narrow bone-dry desert coast, one of the driest places on Earth, is pressed hard against the towering, snow-capped wall of the Andes Mountains, the second highest range on the planet. It is a world of deep ravines, high-altitude grasslands, and punishing extremes of temperature. And it was here, in this challenging vertical world, that a succession of brilliant and resilient cultures would arise, creating a story of human achievement entirely parallel to, but completely independent of, the one we have been following in Mexico. And that story, much like the one in Mesoamerica, begins with a mother culture, a mysterious and powerful religious movement that would unite this rugged landscape for the first time. This was the world of Chavin. Long before the famous Inca built their empire, around the same time the Olmec were carving their colossal heads, a powerful new ideology began to spread from a single, remarkable site nestled deep within the Peruvian highlands. The place is called Chavin de Huantar. It was not a city in the traditional sense, not a great center of population or commerce, but a temple, a pilgrimage center, a place designed to be an intersection point between the human world and the world of the gods. Its location alone tells of its importance. It sits in a narrow valley at the precise junction of two rivers, a place of natural spiritual power. And it also sits at a geographic crossroads, a place that connects the dry Pacific coast, the high mountain peaks, and the humid Amazonian jungle to the east. It was a place designed to draw people in. The temple itself is a masterpiece of psychological architecture, a stage set for a profound and terrifying religious experience. From the outside, it appears as a complex of large, flat-topped stone platforms and a sunken circular plaza. But its most astonishing feature is hidden from view, a labyrinthine network of narrow, stone-lined, pitch-black galleries that run through the interior of the main temple platform. These were not tombs or storage rooms. They were ceremonial passageways designed to disorient and sensory deprive the pilgrim who entered them. Walking through these dark, cramped, and echoing corridors, a visitor would have been cut off from the outside world, their senses heightened. The experience was made even more overwhelming by a sophisticated system of hidden engineering. The priests of Chavan built canals that diverted water from the nearby river to run through channels within the temple structure. The sound of this rushing water, magnified by the acoustics of the stone galleries, would have filled the darkness with a constant, thunderous roar. The air would have boomed with the sound of pututos, sacred trumpets made from giant conch shells, which were also found within the temple. And at the very heart of this dark, roaring labyrinth, at a crossing of several galleries, stands the cult's central deity, the pivot point of the entire Chavan cosmos. It is a 15-foot tall, blade-shaped monolith of white granite, a sculpture known as the lanzon, or Great Spear. It is a terrifying and mesmerizing figure, an anthropomorphic being with a human body, but the head and face of a snarling feline, with great fangs and hair made of writhing snakes. A small hole in the ceiling directly above the lanzon suggests that a priest, hidden from view in the gallery above, could speak into it, his voice seeming to emanate directly from the stone idol itself. The lanzon was an oracle, a god who spoke, the source of the temple's great power. To be a pilgrim brought into this space, your senses already overwhelmed by the darkness, the roaring water, the booming trumpets, and likely heightened by the use of psychoactive plants like the San Pedro cactus, and to then be confronted by this snarling stone god speaking from the shadows would have been a truly transformative and terrifyingly powerful experience. This complex and deliberately confusing imagery, full of hybrid creatures and visual puns, is the hallmark of the Chavin art style. It is an art dominated by powerful predators, especially jaguars, harpy eagles, and caimans, creatures of the distant Amazonian jungle, suggesting that the founders of this highland cult had their origins in the lowlands to the east. This art style, and the religious ideas it represented, became the first great unifying force in the Andes, creating what archaeologists call a cultural horizon. Chavin-style pottery, textiles, and goldwork have been found across a vast swath of ancient Peru, from the coast to the highlands. But this leads to the central mystery. How did it spread? There is almost no evidence of Chavan armies or conquest. It does not seem to have been a political empire built on military might. The more likely answer is that Chavin de Huántar was such a powerful and prestigious religious center that its influence spread voluntarily. Local chiefs and shamans from all over the Andean world would make the long pilgrimage to the temple to consult the great oracle. They would return to their homes, having gained immense prestige from the journey, and they would begin to emulate the powerful art and iconography of the Chavin cult to legitimize their own local authority. The Chavin phenomenon was the spread of a religion, an idea, a shared vision of the cosmos that for the first time wove the scattered peoples of the Andes into a single, great cultural tapestry. When the great unifying religious cult of Chavin began to fade, the Andean world did not descend into a dark age. Instead, the cultural seeds planted by that mother culture began to blossom in new and diverse ways. The centuries that followed saw the rise of powerful regional kingdoms, each with its own distinct flavor, but all sharing a common Andean heritage. Our story now moves from the high mountain valleys down to the stark and beautiful northern coast of Peru. Here, in a landscape where bone-dry desert is punctuated by narrow, fertile river valleys, a new civilization would arise. They were master engineers who built monumental pyramids of mud, and they were brilliant artists whose work would provide one of the most vivid, detailed, and unvarnished windows into the life of any ancient people. They were the Moche. The Moche world was a testament to the power of water. They flourished in a desert so arid that in some places it has never rained in recorded history. Their entire existence depended on their ability to harness the rivers that flowed down from the Andes, and they did so with incredible skill, building a complex network of canals and aqueducts to turn the desert valleys into green, productive farmland. At the heart of each of these valleys, they built great ceremonial and administrative centers dominated by colossal structures called huacas. These were not made of stone, but of millions upon millions of sun-dried adobe bricks. At their capital, the site we simply call Moche, they built two of the largest adobe structures in the ancient world, the Huaca del Sol and the Huaca de la Luna, the pyramids of the sun and the moon, great man-made mountains of earth that served as the stages for their most sacred and violent rituals. The Moche, unlike the Maya, never developed a system of writing, but they did not need one to tell their stories. They left behind a library, not of books, but of clay. Moche ceramic artists are, without exaggeration, among the finest the world has ever known. They created hundreds of thousands of pottery vessels, many of which are so detailed and so expressive that they allow us to see into their world with a startling clarity. Most famous are their portrait vessels. These are not generic human faces. They are stunningly realistic portraits of specific individuals. With a few deft movements in the wet clay, a Moche artist could capture the curve of a lip, the arch of an eyebrow, the tired lines around a man's eyes, or the haughty sneer of a powerful lord. To look at a collection of these pots is to look at a photo album of the Moche elite, a gallery of real people who lived and died over 1,500 years ago. On other vessels, they used a fine line painting technique to create intricate narrative scenes that are like pages from a graphic novel depicting every imaginable aspect of their lives. We see fishermen in their reed boats, weavers at their looms, and hunters chasing deer with spear throwers. We see rulers holding court, messengers running between towns, and women giving birth. But above all, their art returns again and again to the world of ritual, myth, and war. We see elaborately dressed warriors engaged in ritual combat, their goal not to kill their opponent, but to capture him, to ceremonially strip him of his armor and weapons, and to lead him away with a rope around his neck. And in the most famous and recurring scene, known as the presentation theme or the sacrifice ceremony, we see what happened next. The captured prisoners, now naked and bound, have their throats slit. Their blood is collected in a goblet, which is then presented by a priestess to a magnificent godlike figure, a warrior priest with fangs and rays emanating from his head. For a long time, scholars wondered if these grim and dramatic scenes were just myths, stories of the gods acted out in some distant, supernatural realm. But then, in 1987, an incredible discovery was made in a river valley to the north at a site called Saipan. Archaeologists, racing against looters, uncovered a series of unlooted royal tombs. In the central tomb, they found the remains of a Moche lord, buried in a wooden coffin, surrounded by a treasure of gold, silver, and turquoise. And as they carefully documented his burial goods, they realized with a growing sense of awe that he was buried with the exact, specific regalia of the main figure in the sacrifice ceremony. He had the same towering crescent-shaped headdress, the same great circular ear spools, the same war club and shield, the same necklace of golden peanuts. The art was not myth. It was a faithful depiction of real rituals carried out by real people. The Lord of Saipan had been the living embodiment of the warrior priest. Later excavations at the Huaca de la Luna would uncover the actual site of these ceremonies. A plaza filled with the skeletons of sacrificed prisoners, their bones showing the cut marks of their ritual death, their bodies left exposed to be picked clean by vultures, just as the pottery had shown. But for all that their art reveals, a central mystery remains. What was the Moche political structure? Because they were so culturally unified, it was long assumed that they were a single, great empire, ruled from the capital at the Mocha site. But the discovery of the Lord of Saipan and other equally wealthy independent kings buried in other valleys has turned this idea on its head. It now seems far more likely that the Moche world was a collection of smaller, competing kingdoms, each centered on a single river valley and ruled by its own powerful dynasty. They all shared a common culture, a common religion, and a common artistic tradition, but politically they were rivals, not unlike the great city-states of the classic Maya. It was a world of shared belief, but also of constant competition, a world brought to life for us by the stunning and brutally honest artistry of their potters. While the Moche warrior priests were holding court in their great adobe pyramids on the north coast of Peru, another equally brilliant and creative civilization was flourishing to the south. Our story now travels down this same impossibly dry coastline to a series of river valleys where a people we call the Nazca were also mastering the art of desert living. Like the Moche, they were skilled irrigators and brilliant ceramicists. But the Nazca would leave behind a very different kind of testament to their worldview. While the Moche created a library of art to be buried in tombs, the Nazca would turn the very surface of the earth itself into a gigantic, enigmatic canvas. They would create a work of art so vast that it can only be properly seen from the sky, a message written not for human eyes, but for the gods who dwelt in the heavens above. The stage for this monumental undertaking is the Pampa Colorada, a vast, flat, and desolate desert plain. It is one of the driest and most stable environments on the planet. The ground is covered with a dark, rust-colored gravel of desert pavement baked by the sun for millennia. But just beneath this dark surface lies a lighter, yellowish soil. The climate is so arid, with almost no rain and very little wind, that anything etched into this surface is preserved for centuries, as if in a great open-air museum. The Nazca people realized that they had been given a perfect canvas, and upon it they created a work of art that continues to mystify and mesmerize us to this day. The Nazca Lines. Seen from the air, the desert floor is covered with a bewildering network of hundreds, even thousands, of geoglyphs. They fall into two main categories. The first, and by far the most numerous, are the geometric shapes. There are immense, perfectly straight lines, some running for miles across the desert floor, crossing hills and valleys without the slightest deviation. There are also huge trapezoids, triangles, rectangles, and elegant spirals, all laid out with a stunning geometric precision. These vast shapes give the impression of a great, abstract blueprint, a set of mysterious runways and pathways leading to nowhere and everywhere at once. But it is the second category of designs, the biomorphs, that have captured the world's imagination. Scattered among the geometric lines are over 70 immense drawings of animals, plants, and human-like figures. There is a hummingbird, its long beak poised over a flower, its wingspan over 300 feet. There is a spider, rendered with the biological accuracy of an entomologist. There is a graceful condor, a whale, a lizard, and a famous monkey with a great, spiraling tail. Many of these figures are so large that they are impossible to recognize from the ground. They were clearly designed to be seen from a great height, and most remarkably, almost all of them were created using a single, continuous, unbroken line, a line that never crosses itself, as if the artist had set their hand to the earth and never lifted it until the entire creature was complete. For a long time, the sheer scale and perfection of the lines led to wild speculation about their origin, involving ancient astronauts and lost technologies. But the truth is that their creation, while impressive, required cleverness, not magic. The Nazca would have first created a small, two-scale drawing of their design. Then, using simple tools like wooden stakes and long cords of rope, a small team of workers could have meticulously scaled up the drawing onto the desert floor, marking out the lines. The final step was the simplest of all. They would walk along the marked path, carefully removing the dark desert pavement, stone by stone, to reveal the lighter soil beneath. The contrast between the two colors creates the line. The real mystery of the Nazca lines is not how they were made, but the far more profound question of why. What was the purpose of this immense, open-air cathedral of lines and figures? There is no single, easy answer, but several compelling theories offer us a glimpse into the Nazca mind. An early idea, championed by the great German mathematician Maria Rietzsche, who dedicated her life to studying and preserving the lines, was that they formed a vast astronomical calendar. Some of the lines do seem to align with the rising or setting of the sun and other stars on important dates, like the solstices. But further analysis has shown that the vast majority of lines have no meaningful astronomical correlation, so this can only be a small part of the answer. A more recent and powerful theory connects the lines to the Nazca's single, most precious and vital resource: water. In a landscape where rain was almost non existent, the Nazca survived by tapping into underground water sources, building a sophisticated system of subterranean aqueducts. The lines and figures in this interpretation were part of a great ritual landscape of water worship. The animal figures often depict creatures associated with water or fertility in Andean cosmology. The great straight lines might point to the sources of underground water, and the figures themselves may have been sacred pathways. This theory suggests that the Nazca people would walk these lines in great ritual processions, chanting and praying to their gods to ensure the continued flow of water that was the lifeblood of their society. The continuous, unbroken nature of the figure drawings makes them perfectly suited for this kind of processional use. Ultimately, we must accept that we may never know the full and true meaning of the lines. It was a form of communication and worship whose language is now lost to us. But what is certain is that this was an art of profound faith. The Nazca people undertook this immense labor to create images that they themselves, standing on the ground, could never fully see or appreciate. They were writing a prayer upon the skin of the earth, a message intended not for other people, but for the powerful gods and spirits who they believed watched them from the sky above and from the mountains on the horizon. The lines are a silent, beautiful, and deeply moving testament to their belief, a sacred map of a lost cosmology sleeping in the endless sun of the Peruvian desert. For thousands of years, the story of the Andes was one of brilliant but fragmented cultures. The unifying faith of Chavin had faded into a distant memory, and for a millennium, the landscape was a mosaic of powerful but regional kingdoms, like the Moche on the northern coast and the Nazca to the south. The great mountain range, with its deep canyons and towering peaks, seemed to be a natural barrier to any kind of lasting, large-scale unification. But in the early 15th century, from a high and fertile valley centered on a city called Cusco, a small and relatively obscure kingdom of Quechua-speaking people would begin a sudden, explosive, and seemingly unstoppable expansion. In less than a century, they would achieve what no one before them had ever dared to attempt. They would unite the entire Andean world, from the deserts to the mountains to the jungle, into a single, vast, and highly organized state. They called their empire the Tawantinsuyu, the land of the four quarters. We know them as the Inca. For the first 200 years of their existence, the Inca were just one of many small lordships in the highlands, constantly skirmishing with their neighbors. Their story as a world power begins not with a gradual rise, but with a single, desperate, and legendary moment. Around the year 1438, their capital at Cusco was threatened with annihilation by a powerful rival confederation, the Chanca. The reigning Inca king and his designated heir, seeing the situation as hopeless, fled the city. But one of the king's younger sons, a prince named Kusi Yupanqui, refused to run. According to the legends, he had a vision of the great creator god who promised him victory. The young prince rallied the city's remaining warriors, and in a miraculous battle, he not only defended Cusco, but utterly crushed the Chanca army. Following this victory, he took a new name, a name that meant he who remakes the world. He became Pachacuti, and he would live up to his name. Pachacuti was the architect of the Inca Empire, a military genius and an administrative visionary who, along with his son and grandson, would transform the small kingdom of Cusco into the largest empire the Americas had ever seen. They were the great organizers of the ancient world. They understood that to control their vast and vertical empire, they needed to be able to move armies, administrators, and information with incredible speed. Their solution was one of the greatest engineering feats of the ancient world, the Chapac Ñan, the great Inca road system. This was not a collection of simple dirt trails. It was a network of over 25,000 miles of expertly engineered roads, some paved with stone that crossed the harshest terrains imaginable. They built stone stairways that climbed up the steepest mountain faces and spectacular suspension bridges woven from grass fibers that spanned deep river gorges. Along these roads, they built storehouses and inns so that an army on the march would never be without food or shelter. This road was the artery of the empire, and along it flowed the information that held the state together. Since the Inca had no system of writing, they developed a unique and sophisticated device for recording information, the quipu. A quipu was an assemblage of colored and knotted strings. The colors of the strings, the types of knots, and their position on the main cord could all be used to record vast quantities of numerical data. This was the Inca spreadsheet. With it, they could keep track of census data, the contents of their great storehouses, the number of llamas in a herd, and the tribute owed by a newly conquered province. Messages and these knotted records were carried along the roads by a relay system of elite runners called chasques, who could deliver a message from one end of the empire to the other with a speed that rivaled the Roman post. The Inca genius was in administration. When they conquered a new territory, they would typically leave the local leaders in place, but they would require them to send their sons back to Cusco. There, the young nobles would be educated in the Inca language and way of life, effectively becoming acculturated hostages who would ensure their family's loyalty back home. They imposed the worship of their sun god, Inti, as the supreme deity of the empire, but they cleverly allowed conquered peoples to continue worshiping their own local gods, so long as they acknowledged the supremacy of the Inca pantheon. The entire empire was powered by a system of labor tax called the mita. Every able-bodied person was required to work for the state for a certain number of months each year. It was this mita labor that built the great roads, the temples, and the agricultural terraces that fed the empire. But what was the engine that drove this shockingly rapid and relentless expansion? This is one of the great mysteries of the Inca. A major part of the answer may lie in their unique beliefs about death and inheritance. When a Sapa Inca, the divine emperor, died, his body was carefully mummified. But in the Inca worldview, he was not truly dead. His mummy was treated as a living person who continued to own all of the lands, palaces, and wealth that he had acquired during his lifetime. His mummy would be brought out for great ceremonies, attended by servants, and consulted for its opinion. This meant that when a new emperor came to the throne, he inherited the supreme title and the divine authority, but almost none of the actual wealth or land, which still belonged to his dead father. In order to build his own prestige, to have his own palaces, and to secure a glorious afterlife for his own mummy, a new emperor had only one option. He had to conquer new territories and acquire new wealth of his own. This system of split inheritance created a built-in and unstoppable engine of conquest. Each new king was forced to expand the empire, or he would be a king in name only. It was a brilliant but ultimately unsustainable system that in less than 100 years would push the borders of the Tawantinsuyu to their absolute limits. Within the grand and humming machinery of the Inca Empire, with its great roads, its meticulous records, and its sacred capital at Cusco, there was also room for places of quiet and secluded beauty. The great emperors, for all their divine status and public duties, also built for themselves private estates, royal retreats nestled in the most breathtaking landscapes of their vast domain. And it is to the most beautiful, the most mysterious, and the most perfectly preserved of all these royal sanctuaries that our long journey through the ancient Americas now takes us. We travel to a place that was built in secret, lived in for less than a century, and abandoned so completely that it was lost to the outside world for 400 years, a final, stunning jewel of the Inca world, sleeping in a cradle of mist-clad mountain peaks. We travel to Machu Picchu. To approach Machu Picchu is to feel as though you are ascending into a different world. It is perched with an almost impossible grace on a high, narrow ridge, a saddle between two jagged peaks, nearly 8,000 feet above sea level. Below, the sacred Urubamba River roars through a deep, jungle-choked gorge. All around, the green pointed heads of other Andean peaks, the Apus or mountain spirits, rise up like silent, eternal guardians. The site is often shrouded in a drifting ethereal mist, which will suddenly part to reveal the astonishing spectacle of a stone city floating in the clouds. It is a place designed to inspire a sense of profound awe, a location chosen because it was a point of intense connection between the earth and the sky. The city itself is a masterpiece of environmental design, a testament to the Inca philosophy of working in harmony with the landscape. The Inca architects did not impose their will upon the mountain. They entered into a conversation with it. The stonework, for which they are so famous, is at its most sublime here. Using only bronze and stone tools, they cut and shaped granite blocks with such impossible precision that they fit together without a drop of mortar, creating elegant, earthquake-proof walls that feel as much a part of the natural rock as the mountain itself. Great natural stone outcrops are not cleared away, but are incorporated into the walls of temples, the sacred rock of the mountain flowing seamlessly into the sacred work of human hands. Hundreds of stone agricultural terraces, held in place by retaining walls, cascade down the steep slopes, not only providing land to grow maize and other crops, but also preventing erosion and landslides. A sophisticated 1,600-foot-long canal system, fed by a natural spring, brought fresh water down from the mountain, channeling it through a series of 16 beautiful stone fountains that provided for the needs of the inhabitants. At the highest point of the city stands a strange and beautiful carved pillar of rock the Intihuatana, the hitching post of the sun. It is a precise astronomical instrument, a clock whose corners and shadows align perfectly with the sun's position on the solstices, a way of ritually binding the sun to the earth at the crucial turning points of the year. But what was this breathtaking place for? This is the final, enduring mystery of Machu Picchu. It was clearly not a typical city, as it was too small and too remote to be a center of population or commerce. And despite its easily defensible location, it lacks the massive fortifications of a true military fortress. The most compelling theory is that Machu Picchu was a royal estate, a country palace built around the year 1450 by the great emperor who founded the Inca Empire, Pachacuti. It was his private retreat, a place for him and his royal court to escape the pressures of the capital, to relax, to worship, and to feel a close connection to the sacred landscape. It was a place of peace, of ceremony, and of rejuvenation. It was a life, however, that would not last long. The estate was likely in use for only 80 years. When the Spanish conquest in the 1530s shattered the Inca Empire and threw the entire Andean world into chaos, Machu Picchu was quietly and peacefully abandoned. Its inhabitants simply locked the doors and walked away, their reasons lost to us. Perhaps the great road that led to it was deliberately destroyed to keep its location secret. Perhaps the royal family that owned it was wiped out in the civil wars that preceded the conquest. Whatever the reason, its remote location saved it from the fate of Cusco and other great Inca sites. The Spanish never found it, and so the jungle slowly moved in, covering the stone walls with a thick blanket of green, and the city slept, its existence known only to a few local farmers, until it was brought to the attention of the wider world once more in 1911. And so here, at this place of silent, breathtaking beauty, our journey must come to an end. We have traveled a very long way together, from the first tentative footsteps across an icy land bridge more than 15,000 years ago. We have stood in the presence of the brooding Olmec heads and walked the ball courts where Maya kings played for their lives. We have felt the silence of Cahokia's great mounds and looked up at the sun from the floor of Chaco Canyon. We have paddled the canals of the Aztec capital and descended into the dark, roaring galleries of Chavin. It has been a journey through worlds that rose, flourished, and fell long before our own, a testament to the endless creativity and resilience of the human spirit. The story of ancient America is a story of 1,000 different ways of seeing the world, of 1,000 different answers to the great questions of life and the cosmos. These worlds may be gone, but their ghosts, their whispers, their beautiful and enigmatic ruins are still with us. They are a quiet reminder, written in stone and earth, of the vast and mysterious story of humanity on this continent. Thank you for listening. I wish you the most peaceful of nights and the sweetest of dreams.